Welcome to a very special bonus episode of Not Quite Right.
Woohoo!
My name is Ed.
And I'm Amanda.
It's the Longlist episode.
I'm very excited. I'm here in my finest tracksuit pants.
Me too. It's finally cooled down enough.
I thought I'd get real comfy for this one because I know it's going to be a doozy.
It is going to be a long one. I think last time we were recording for almost 6 hours or something like that.
I lost all track of time and space. Philippa Freegard in her comp entry, she said, I really love the generously long podcast. So, Philippa, we are about to make your day.
So in this episode, we'll be talking about the April round of the Not Quite Right prize, all our stats, all our shout-outs. We've got a bit of Q&A, and we'll also be showcasing a couple of our Daredevil stories this episode. Those are the people who have purchased the Daredevil entry package, and we'll be reading and dissecting their stories in detail on the podcast. So we'll just be reading 2 of those in this episode and the other 3 in the shortlist episode, which will be released hot on the tails of this episode. And then at the end of this episode, we will be reading out the long list and announcing the long list for this round of the comp.
So settle in, get your comfy tracky dacks on because it's going to be a long one.
But quickly before we get started, just a call out to any Central Coast or Sydney locals. It's time again for the Words on the Waves Writers Festival, which is on between May 29th and June the 3rd at Umina here on the Central Coast. So Amanda and I will be there again this year, catching some of the talks and interviewing authors. So if any of our listeners are planning on going, definitely say hi. We would love to meet our listeners and anyone who's entered the competition. That would be amazing.
Absolutely. We'll be there in our custom Not Quite Right hoodies.
And that's the only way you'll be able to recognise us because we look nothing like the picture on our website. So try not to look too disappointed when you meet us in person.
Might have to wear a mask or something. Okay, so I brought something for you. I meant to bring it last time and then I forgot, but here it is.
Oh, so this is Swan Song, a flash fiction collection. Is this where your story has been?
Yeah, so it's a zine. It's actually the final edition of Ellipsis zine, which is why it's called Swan Song, and it's a collection of flash fiction. But yeah, it was actually the first time my fiction has been published in print.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thanks.
There's about 20 or so stories published in here. How did you make it happen?
Yes, well, in fact, I would encourage all entrants to this competition to do exactly what I did, which is you've got your story now, go shop it around. And this particular story, I believe it did Longlist in Furious Fiction, but it didn't win. But nevertheless, it's found its forever home in a published work. So basically, you just find a zine or a website or some kind of anthology that you would like to be published in that suits the work that you've written. And then you just follow their submission guidelines and hope for the best, fingers crossed.
Great. Then that's the great thing about writing competitions as well. I mean, you retain the rights to your work and you can always change it. You can always improve it, grow it into something bigger and shop it around. So well done on doing that. So let's get to the competition and let's get to the stats. So as always, we'll be shouting out some of the entries throughout this episode. That doesn't necessarily mean you have or haven't made the long list or the short list. These are just entries that we've selected to shout out for various reasons.
And we'll be announcing the long list at the very end. So if you can't wait, skip ahead, but hopefully jump back because we will be having a bit of an interesting chat about all the different creative ways that people have handled the prompts and some other creative takes that I think are really interesting. I'm interested in your general opinion. Like, what was the vibe in this round for you?
I felt the quality overall is improving with each round. One thing I noticed, because I watch on the website as the entries are coming in, we didn't get as many entries early on.
No.
Like I think some people took the feedback of just spend a little bit more time reworking a story and improving it. And a lot more of the entries to me came on the second day and towards the end of that second day.
I've got some stats on that.
Do you?
So
Great.
yeah, to prove your point there. What I thought was interesting, and we might get into this a little bit later, but I think it had a lot to do with the prompts that we selected, but I got much more like quiet stories. And when there was drama, it was sort of those smaller vignettes, those life moments. And I think that had a lot to do with the difference between like punch being the word prompt last time and date being the word prompt this time. And also picking a winner, I think.
Yeah, there's less conflict implied in both of those prompts.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, by all means, you can insert conflict anywhere. And in fact, I would encourage that. But it was very violent last time. This time was very romantic. So
yeah, for some reason, a lot less punching.
Yeah, funnily enough. All right, let's get stuck into some of those stats, shall we? So there were 212 entries overall, which is a similar number to last time. So I guess you can treat all the stats pretty similarly.
Yeah.
They're quite comparable comps.
Yeah. So there were 20 countries represented, which is very similar to what we had last time. I think there may have been 22 or so. And this is all an optional thing that you can do when you submit. So not everyone said where they were from. And what I noticed this time around is that there were fewer Australians and more Americans. So I think last time the overwhelming majority were Australian. This time, I believe it's 50-50.
The Yankees are coming.
50-50 Americans versus Australian. And each of them were about a third of the entries. So a third Australian, a third American, and then a third everyone else, of which probably nearly half of those were UK and Canada. So I think going a little bit more international with this round, but still dominated by those English-speaking countries, as you'd expect.
As you'd expect. Absolutely. What about the male to female to other gender breakdown?
Yeah, very similar to last time as well. We have 67% female, 27% male, with the remaining 6% being non-binary, prefer not to say. Age-wise, it is also, again, similar to last time and not too surprising. So the largest representative group was the 31 to 45 range, which we both fall in.
Yep. Just for you.
Thanks for reminding me. Yeah, so that's not too surprising. And then it kind of goes in a bell curve from there in either direction.
Many under 18s this time around?
Only 6 under 18s this time around.
Hello.
And 24 over 60s. So I think, it is skewing a little bit older in that demographic there.
Now, the number of words we had to read was 100,497, but we read a lot of those words way more than once.
We sure did.
So that's about an equivalent number of words to Kill a Mockingbird, but it's like we just got really obsessed with it and just reread it a bunch of times. Now, disqualifications. So we had a few this round, which again is not out of the ordinary, all of which excluded because they didn't use the word date in the body of their story.
And there were 3, I believe, that had to be disqualified for that.
Just can't stress enough how important it is to check that right at the end because it is, especially date, which I know was sort of hidden in some of those words, that it was easy to lose and easy to drop. So just make sure you've got that under control because one of these people, I'm sorry to say, would have potentially made the long list had it not been for that exclusion. So it's a real shame, but it's easily done.
Yeah. And the word prompt is the easiest for us to check and we can do that just as part of reading.
We don't tend to disqualify on the basis of missing others. And there were a couple of ones where I'm like, nobody really picked any winners in this story or outside of this story.
We've said in the past, as long as you can make an argument for meeting the other 2 prompts, that's fine. We'll put it through again. It comes down to the story and have you made an attempt. With the word prompt, this time around date, it is pretty clear cut. If that word is not on there, then we cannot put you on the long list or the short list.
That's it. Now, you mentioned it earlier, just the timing of the submissions. So just to back up your anecdotal evidence there, we had 44 submitted in the last hour, which is 21% of all the entries were submitted in the last hour, which is a new record because the previous comp was 12%.
Yeah.
So that's massive. That's nearly double the number that was leaving it to that final hour. We had 3 stories that was submitted bang on midnight, and then we had 4 in the few minutes it took to close the form. So we have said that it's okay. Look, once you're in there, you can stay in there for a little bit. But once you have gone over that 12 midnight, do take care because there's no promises. It's not open forever.
It is
But
not.
I think as well, like if you did miss it, like again, that happens. Like for whatever reason, life gets in the way and it is a shame, especially if you've gone to the trouble of writing something and you miss out. But I hope you still take something away from it. Like either you have a draft or you can participate in this episode and engage in the discussion about the prompts. So not all is lost. Now, the shortest entry we had this time was actually way longer than the other shortest entries we had. So it was 198 words, which was Horse on a Boat by Henry Jarvis. So that didn't beat the previous record, which was 139 words in January, and I think something like 20-something words.
I think it was just a paragraph, wasn't it?
It was the very first one.
So the longest title that we have last time was 13 words, which was equaled again this time around by Shlomo Tries Again at the annual Treasury Secretary Earthworm performance and cosplay pageant, which is written by Galen Gower. But Galen Gower only came 3rd this time around for the longest title. Second place goes to a story by Autumn Bettinger, which is Oregon's annual sea glass scavenger hunt in collaboration with Siletz Bay Glassblowing and the Tourist Board of Lincoln City. And I'm sure Autumn Bettinger was confident on winning the title of longest story. But
How many words?
20 words on
20
that
words.
one. But they were beaten by Sally Simon, who had a guide to judging the pie entries at the Women's Auxiliary Club annual fair from last year's judge, who should have known better, at a whopping 23 words. And I don't think the title field is limited, but I think we should limit it before things get really out of hand.
Look, you framed that as a competition there. This is not a competition.
No.
And personally, I would say I have a little bit of a bias against long titles, not that it would affect my judgment of the story.
I have to say at least one of those, Sally Simon's Guide to Eating Pie Entries, the title did shed a bit of light onto the content of the story. So sometimes titles can be an effective way of adding more to your story.
And we do have an article on the website for the members of Not Quite Right, which does go into some advice about effective titles. It's part of the Level Up series about how to choose a killer title. Another thing I noticed was that we didn't have as many maybe what I would call risk takers. So there were no rhyming stories.
No.
And
there was very little hermit crab fiction.
Yeah.
I think I remember maybe 2 or 3.
So when we say hermit crab, if you're not familiar, it means a story that's sort of put in another type of written format.
Yeah.
So like a diary entry or a letter.
A shopping list.
Or whatever it might be. Yeah, there was a couple and they were fairly tentative. Like they were still pretty close to story form. A couple of types of correspondence, for example. But yeah, not as many big risks in that regard, although we did see some other types of risks, which we'll get into in terms of the anti-prompt. But now, my favourite stats.
This is Amanda's swearing stats. So lock up your children.
Lock up your children. Tell them to fuck off for a bit because the adults are talking.
Before you actually give the numbers, my perception was the swearing was toned down a whole lot this time around, like way less.
Way down.
Yeah.
Way down. And the stats back you up on that one. I noticed it as well. I was like, hang on, what's going on here? And again, it's not a competition. I just think it's funny. So, as I always do, I'm going to ask you, which do you think was the most commonly used swear word?
It had to have been fuck and it would have been like in 3 or 4 stories that contained almost all of the instances.
Absolutely 100% correct. So in this case, and it was down from last time, but we did have 56 fucks or fuckwits. No motherfuckers this time.
Yeah.
I will call out one entry, which was called That's What She Shed by MT Christian, which used 19 fucks.
Yeah, I think that's the one I was thinking of.
That's a huge percentage of the word count. Very brave. And then we also had Don't Fuck With Chase by Stuart C. Anderson, which went with a fuck in the title.
Yeah, I think wasn't there a couple with fuck in the title?
There was a couple with fuck in the title, but then the first line of this story was a line of dialogue, which was simply fuck, fuck, fuck. So I feel like, I don't know, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that Stuart and MT Christian really wanted to hear their names on the podcast today. And there you go. You've done your mothers proud there with that one. So the next most common swear word is, again, shits of all kinds, 25, none of which were holy this time. And again, way down. That's way down on last time. We had ass, and holes thereof at 9, piss or pissed at 3, 6 bastards. This one was up. We had 11 bitches. Last time we only had 5 bitches. One thing that I found really interesting this round was that we had 0 dicks and 0 cocks. We had 3 pricks, which is up from last time. So I don't know if this is a winter shrinkage issue or what's going on. But one thing I have noted in previous rounds is that there were never any vaginas, and there is one this time. It was actually only mentioned in the brief explanation field.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
But there was a vagina, a
broken vagina.
A broken vagina. And happily, just to round out that stat and just for women's equality, bring it equal to the pricks, in addition to the 1 vagina, we had 2 cunts this time around.
Yes.
So thanks for that, everyone. I just wanted to say something about the swearing, though, because although I have fun with this because some sort of repressed childhood issue that I have, I don't know. But one thing I did want to call out is just that it needs to be authentic. So I think there were a couple of instances where there was swearing thrown in there that didn't feel authentic. And so you just have to think carefully about that, I think.
It still has to be in line with what your characters would and wouldn't say.
And the tone of
flow
your
from the
story.
story.
Like, I'm always banging on about pose single effect. Like if it's not fitting that effect, then it's probably better left out.
Yeah.
And like you can't just go for shock value. Like we've talked about this before. There's been a couple of times where it's in the first line and the shock value really does get our attention. I mean, maybe it'll be less so down the track when we've seen it many times, but it's not enough. Like it does have to fit the tone. So do bear that in mind if you're trying to jump on the swearing stats for next time around.
That's it for the stats, but we'll be talking a little bit more about the stats specifically for the prompts a little bit later. But for now, let's go to the questions from our listeners and from our entrants. What have you got?
So first of all, I wanted to just do a bit of a shout out to all the people who bothered to give us a little bit of feedback about how much fun you had. Because we do read those comments and it's really rewarding. Like it's a gift. I know everyone pays to enter and to help offset the time and so on, but it really is a labour of love.
Yeah.
We spend countless hours on this. And so it's nice to know that people are having a really good time and that they're enjoying the anti-prompt, for example. So,
Absolutely. We love to hear it.
Yeah, we love to hear it. So thank you for that. It warms the cockles of my cold, dead heart. Now, one thing some participants did have an issue with is the form, right? We've talked about this before, the entry form. Now, some people love it, by the way. Some people are like, it's great, it's simple. I was on my phone, so I found it really easy. Like I'm out and about and I could still enter my story. So that's great. But some people are struggling with it. So I just wanted to touch on a couple of things. Like it's not WYSIWYG, right? It's not what you see is what you get, the form. It's quite a simple form. A couple of people mentioned that they weren't able to add spaces or line breaks once they'd pasted their story in.
Oh, interesting.
Now, the reason for that, I believe, is that you've hit the word count, okay?
Yeah.
And so if your word count, and again, it's counted by the form, right? So some punctuation like M dashes, if they're separated by spaces from the words around them, it's going to count as a word. And so trying to add a space or a line break, it's not going to let you because it's like suggesting that like you've hit that count. So that might be the issue that you're having. If so, you might need to go back and do a little bit of editing. Sarah Hurd said, I beg of you, if nothing else, please give us the ability to indent in the submission form. Now, technically you can actually. You can paste a tab into the form, right? So if I press tab and then start my paragraph, if you copy paste that, you won't see it in the form, but it will come out on the other end if that's important to you.
I will say, though, what we do with your submission is not read it straight off the form as a text. We, first of all, depersonalize it, split it into batches, but then we export it all into Word documents. And those Word documents do format it in a way that looks presentable.
Yeah, they all look pretty good on the other end, so I wouldn't stress too much about that. But I do know sometimes you want to use like formatting tools for a reason to just highlight things, in which case we do allow italics and bold, and we do that using asterisks and forward slashes, and we manually fix that up on the other end if you would like to do that. Understand it's not perfect, but it does meet our needs, and we do have some information about that on the website as well about why we use the form that way. But it is something that's on our minds as competition entrants. We want to make that user-friendly experience.
Yeah, and we're always looking at improving.
Yeah, we're always looking at improving. You can't please everyone. Some people do love that simple form, but we'll see what we can do as we go along. Now, a couple of people mentioned struggling with the clock because they live overseas.
Yeah.
And we do have a countdown clock in the participant lounge. So if that's something you're struggling with, you can always rely on the countdown clock. The other thing I would recommend, and I have an iPhone, for example, if you use the clock app, there's a little world clock. You can go in and create a clock for Sydney and then look at that instead of your own clock wherever you are.
If you're a Windows user as well, you can do that in Windows in the little clock in the bottom right-hand corner. You can set up multiple time zones in there and it will show you the time for those in that little clock as well. So,
or just Google it. But yeah,
you can Google it.
I think it's fairly simple to use the countdown clock. So maybe check there because it does my head in. Like, I'm trying to figure it out. When I'm entering the New York City Midnight Comp, that's definitely something I struggle with. One person asked for a slightly more flexible word count, like plus or minus 10%.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about that in the past, but it's actually the same thing.
It's totally the same thing.
Because you can say plus or minus 10%. It's just a new word count, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think the challenge is all about being concise, right? That's what flash fiction is about. And so, sorry, I'm going to have to say no to that one. I understand the frustration of trying to get those last few words down, but I guarantee you'd be having the same problem at 550. So it's just the nature of the challenge. I'd also like to shout out those people who indicated in their feedback that they're challenging themselves potentially for the first time or for the first time in a long time to write creatively. And I just want to warmly welcome you
Yeah.
because it's a competition. It can feel intimidating sometimes. And maybe if you're on the forum, for example, and you're seeing these accomplished writers who've been entering comps for a while, well, guess what? That could be you in a while, but you have to start somewhere. And we've all started somewhere. And you and I would say we've learned so much since we first started writing and would probably be mortified by our early entries.
Completely.
And I don't know, I just think you should be proud of yourselves because how else are you going to learn if you don't give it a go? So welcome, and I hope you have a good time. And whether or not you have a chance of winning, and I think you may still have a chance. In fact, I know that one of our wild cards last time, that was her first piece of fiction in a very, very long time, and she got a wild card. So it's totally doable. And regardless, whether you rank or not, and even for the experienced writers who potentially get frustrated at not long listing frequently, I hope you find that you have a draft of something that you're proud of, and I hope you enjoy these discussions and being part of this experience, whether or not you get a gong at the end. And just to quote Emily Gray, who made this comment in her feedback on the form, there is no better way to generate material than competitions like these, and whatever the outcome, a writer always comes out with a draft. Isn't that just so true?
Completely true. And as you've demonstrated with your Ellipsis zine entry, it's not wasted. Even if you don't win, you can still get published, you can still develop your piece, and at the very least, you can improve yourself as a writer.
Absolutely. All right, now to some questions on social media. So Nina Miller on Twitter asked, what keeps the stories from jumbling in your head? Do you have a literary palate cleanser that you read? A song to clear your thoughts? A video game, perhaps?
It's a great question because they do jumble.
They do.
Quite a lot, especially if you try to read too many at once. I think this time around I tried to split it up a fair bit, like one batch per day, maybe two batches. But inevitably, they do kind of start to kind of mix in together a little bit.
Becomes hard to be objective.
It does become hard to be objective. You can try at the beginning. I made a conscious effort to kind of try and be very balanced, and I've got a rating system that I use and trying to be consistent, but it's really impossible, not to be subjective and not to prejudice a story based on how you're feeling in the moment a little bit. What I find that helps me concentrate is not any music or song, but I like to just listen to white noise while I'm reading, and that just blocks everything out and lets me just focus on what I'm doing at the moment, and I find it very calming. That's me.
Well, I would say that when the stories are starting to get jumbled up for me, I would stop is probably the main thing. Yeah. My main literary palate cleanser is sleep.
Yeah, that's true.
Just having a break completely. But it can also be hard sometimes judging, like say it's been a few days between and then trying to be back on the same wavelength.
What you were thinking and having the same kind of benchmark.
Yeah, the same benchmark. Exactly. So it's kind of works both ways in a way. Like almost if you did them all at once, you could be a little bit more consistent in a way. But of course you'd start to get maybe potentially a bit jaded about certain things over time. So it's basically impossible. And so for those people when you are at home and going, what the hell, why didn't I make the long list? That's bullshit. My story's better than those. You're probably right, and it's possible that subjectively yours was discounted for some reason. But I will say that when I see ones that I think are borderline, I always leave them in with a chance. I don't just dismiss out of hand on first read. It's like, look, this is borderline. I'm going to put that in and come back to it later after I've read a few more, or come back to it later when I'm feeling more objective.
Yeah, I've definitely put notes to myself of I'll come back to this one later. Like I think it's got something, but maybe I'm not all there at the moment to be able to absorb, but I don't necessarily just want to sit down and reread the same story in the middle of judging. So I put a note to come back to it. And the other control we have is that there are two of us.
Yeah.
So if one of us was not in a great mood or in a great state of mind for a story, then the other one might have been. And there were a lot of stories that I think one of us liked, the other person discounted for whatever reason, and then later came back to and found that there was actually something there.
So now we had a couple of people, Tom on Twitter and Holly on Instagram, asking basically, do we ever disagree about whether to long list or short list? One loves it, the other one doesn't. How do we resolve the conflict?
This time around, I think we were much more different in our opinion than
100%.
the past one, which I think in the January comp we were very much aligned, I think, on the long list and the short list. We did have some disagreements, I think, in the ordering.
Yeah.
But this time around we had a lot more trouble getting to, especially the short list. The long list we were almost there on.
When it came down to choosing stories for the shortlist, and we each sort of went back to the long list again and were thinking about, okay, is it going to make it to the shortlist or not? And I had my own little system, which was like, yes, no, maybe, strong, maybe. That was my system. And your system was similar, I think.
It was similar. I gave them A, B, C, D, and then pluses and minuses just to have some gradation in case we needed to get to that level.
So when it got to the shortlist, I was finding that ones I was saying straight, yes, I reckon this belongs on the shortlist. You were saying straight, no. Yeah. And the ones you were saying straight, yes, I was saying straight, no. Yeah. So not even a maybe.
Even some of your favourites I think I had as no.
And then some that I had as favourites that on reread.
Yeah. And same. So.
Yeah, that I had, my opinion differed after I'd read a bunch of other stories. So,
I mean, I guess that's the counterpart. Sometimes you're in the exact right frame of mind to absorb a story, and it may not be the best story. And when you reread it, you realise that it was a lot about what you're feeling in that moment.
For sure. So I did find it hard this time. We spent a lot more time determining the shortlist, that's for sure.
We arrived at the shortlist maybe a couple of hours ago, actually, before recording this episode. And out of the long list, there were probably a good 12 contenders for the shortlist, which we had to whittle down to 6. It was really a game of pros and cons.
Yeah.
Like it was very difficult to settle on 6. So, I think the other 6 people would be maybe happy to hear that they were very close and
maybe very unhappy to hear.
It could have gone a different way, but it was very hard to separate those top 12
It
or 14.
was very hard to be objective purely because they all had strengths and weaknesses. And it's like, well, this one might be very weak on this issue, but very strong on this other thing that we love. Whereas this one might be sort of middling on a bunch of stuff. And it's like, how do you compare that? It's impossible. But I guess what it comes down to is that, yes, it's difficult for us to agree sometimes and sometimes not. Because I think a really strong story will stand out to both of us.
Yeah.
But between us, nobody got hurt. But I feel like it's a bit of a bloodbath for those several that didn't quite make the shortlist. Yeah.
I do feel that too.
And we feel that. Like, we take it seriously.
Yeah.
We don't just go, whatever. It's like, I want to be able to justify what I'm saying.
Yeah, definitely there were several of those stories that I felt bad that didn't make it to the shortlist because they were at shortlist quality.
Yeah.
But we've got to draw the line at 6.
Somewhere, 100%. So, fan favourite, Greg Schmidt, who we may remember from Untitled number 2, asked on Twitter, how do you decide on the prompts, particularly the word and action prompts? Are they just random or is there some design behind how they go together? None of your beeswax, Greg. No, I did promise nothing would be off the table. So how do we come up with our prompts?
What I've said in the past is, and it's not something we stick to, but as a general guideline, I mean, the word prompt, I guess, gets you thinking a little bit, maybe conjures up some options for a story to write about, and there should be some different ways that you can frame that word and maybe longer words you can create out of that word. So it might have different meanings, like in the case of date or punch, there are different meanings that you can come up with. And it has to be interesting. Those connotations should be interesting. They shouldn't lock you into one thing or another, and they shouldn't be boring. Like, we're not going to choose table. We might choose table.
Yeah, actually, that's a bad example.
That's a bad example. We're not going to choose, I don't know, something really boring.
Dog.
Yeah,
we might choose dog.
We're not going to choose something boring that makes you look at it and go, who wants to write a story about
uninspiring,
whatever.
Yeah.
The action prompt, I've said before, tries to, I guess, incite some sort of conflict. That's, I think, more true for the first 2 rounds of the prize that we've had. Picking a winner is more of a positive implication. This time around, there was less conflict. So I think that's something for us to keep in mind.
Yeah, because I'll be honest, I was disappointed about the lack of conflict. And it reflect on kind of the vibes of the story. It's great to do a quiet story sometimes, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But I think there still does need to be an element of conflict at some level.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, like, it's not enough to just choose a winner. That's not a story. That's just a thing that happened.
Yeah. So crossing a line, spilling something, and picking a winner, the thing that they share in common, they can be interpreted in multiple ways as well. So it does give you some flexibility. I mean, these are not hard and fast rules, but they're considerations that we have when we look through options and we try to work out, well, what would we want to write about, I guess, as well? What's interesting to us?
Yeah. We want it to inspire and not constrain, basically. And we want to believe that ourselves. So we want to be able to look at the prompts and go, that feels fun to us.
Exactly. And with the anti-prompt, I mean, the anti-prompt can be tricky as well, because I guess when it comes down to rules of writing, there are only so many. So we need to select one that we think is, again, interesting, that is doable, and that we would want to write about as well.
Yeah. And one that promotes sort of a learning point too, because for those who are unfamiliar with these so-called writing rules, to be able to engage with that rule and understand why it exists and then challenge yourself to break it, that's a lot to ask. But I think that's what makes this comp special, and I think it is a creative challenge that people are really getting on board with. So it's fun to see, and I can't wait to talk about the anti-prompt very soon.
Yep.
All right. So some guy, also known as David, on Twitter said, I find show don't tell a really unhelpful phrasing for such essential advice. How would you two or anyone, if they want to chime in, phrase it differently? I wanted to ask, have we discussed this before? I can't recall if we've discussed it on the podcast before.
We haven't talked about show don't tell. I don't think we have. We've talked about write what you know, and they have, I guess, similar limitations in the way that they're expressed, because you have to, it's a pithy phrase, like you have to sum it up in a few words.
Yeah, but it actually means a lot.
It can mean a lot of different things, and show don't tell as well. It's a nice shorthand, but it has a lot of ways that it is misunderstood. I guess for me, what show don't tell reflects is the way that people connect with other people is not through description. It is through observing and interacting with them. So you might hear about someone that they are an annoying person, and in your mind you might have that idea of, oh, they're an annoying person. That's a description. But when you meet someone and they annoy you, that's something you feel on a visceral level. Like it's something that you are now. I don't just know that. I am now angry at them because they're so annoying. That's how you want to build your characters. You want to build them in a way that people can connect with them emotionally. And so you do that by showing them rather than just explaining what they're like. And that's what it means to me.
And it allows the reader to join those dots themselves rather than just like stating everything for them to know. Like John was annoying is different to like describing a bunch of annoying stuff that John did, and then me understanding that John is annoying by that and being able to experience that as if John's in the room with me.
Yeah.
Now, it's huge. There's a million different ways we could tackle this. I suggest what we do is we tackle this in a future episode because I think it's warranted. And I do think, look, we're just talking about how we choose anti-prompts and so on. I'm sure show don't tell will be in the mix at some point. It's one of the most famously talked about quote unquote rules of writing. So stay tuned for that because I'm sure it'll be in there down the track. So Dean Corey on Twitter said, I'm curious to know the simple breakdown of POVs in the stories or point of view in stories, first versus second versus third, percentage-wise from the entries you received. To which I say, don't you think we already had enough to do? Giving me more work to do, and I did do it, and it took me for bloody ever. So I hope you really enjoy these stats, Dean.
Oh, you did?
I did.
Oh, my God.
Right?
You're such a pushover.
I know, I'm a real pushover. That sucks. But then Athena got on board, and, you know, we have a lot of respect for Athena.
Dean have his own writing competition?
Yeah, Dean.
Can't he do his own stats?
Yeah, Dean. Everybody jump on Twitter, DM Dean Corey, and tell him for the next Furious Fiction all the real random stats you want to know. All right? That will be your award. Okay. But just to satisfy that curiosity, and I will say just as a quick disclaimer, I did do this quickly. Okay. It was mainly based on the first couple of lines of the story. Some stories switch point of view partway through, which is called head hopping, which is another rule of writing. If you want to look that up, I'm sure that'll be in the mix down the track as well. But
some stories also may appear to be one perspective, but they're not.
Yes. Yeah. So some of them I had to keep reading to go, hang on, what is this? But anyway, so this is just, it was a quick run through. It should be pretty representative. So do you want to hazard a guess, Ed, of which was most?
I would assume third person by like 2/3.
Bing, bing, bing. Correct.
Oh, really?
So third person, we had 132 entries, which were largely written in third person. So it was 62% third person, 36% first person, and 2% second person, which was just 4 entries in this case. So much, much more rare.
Yeah.
But with the third person situation, so one of those was a hermit crab, like a user guide. It's very hard to say, what is that? It's sort of not a POV at all. It's a user guide, right? But I chucked it into third person just because of the way it was written. And then there was 10 entries which were entirely transcribed dialogue.
Yes,
So
that was a
again,
common one because of the anti-prompt, obviously.
Because of the anti-prompt, and we'll get into that, but it's basically a conversation that's entirely transcribed with very little, and in some cases no dialogue tags or action beats or anything to go along with it, which is a very brave way of handling the prompt. So good for you if you did that. So difficult to say, but I threw that in the third person category because we're witnessing this conversation and no one's claiming it as their own, I guess. What I thought was interesting as well, a couple of the first person ones, 3 of those were hermit crab style. So it was correspondence between characters, and one was an Amazon review. I've said that was first person because the person was writing their review about what happened to them. So yeah, interesting mix, but only 4 stories that were written in second person. There
Well, not
you go.
surprising. The number of novels I've read in second person, I think probably 2.
Yeah, I think it's easier to get away with in flash fiction, but it's a challenging style of writing. Anyway, hope you're happy, Dean. Hope you're happy, Athena. Hope that brought you some joy because it stole hours of my life that I will never get back. All right, moving on. So Alicia Rourke on Instagram said, how do you weigh the varying emotions between comedy and darker pieces to make a final call on what makes it or doesn't?
We did speak about this a little bit earlier, and not to give away any specifics, but we did have one story that we were considering for one of our lists that was a lot more, I guess, lighthearted and fun. And we had that going up against ones that are a little bit more serious.
Yeah, and I think it is harder. It's a harder barrier to jump with a lighthearted story.
Yeah.
Just because of that poignancy sometimes can come through in a darker story. But nevertheless, like, we love comedy. I think to me what it is did this story achieve what it set out to do really well? So if it's a comedy, for example, was it really funny?
Yeah.
And if it was, then it's been successful versus a story that may be dark or disturbing. I have no problem with dark or disturbing stories. If they achieve some visceral reaction, well, then they've been successful.
Yeah.
But you're not just going to win because the dog died. We've said this before.
Yeah,
you're not going to win on that basis. I have to feel really, really sad about that because of your story. It has to sort of be effective as a story to get through. So I think really we're comparing the effectiveness of a story in achieving what it appears to have set out to achieve.
And I have to say, sometimes we're a little bit on guard as well, or at least I am, when it comes to some stories that are dealing with very heavy emotional topics, because that is often, it's a little bit of a shortcut, or it's a little bit of a trope. Like, there's some very common themes in flash fiction where just bad stuff happens.
Yeah.
And it's very easy to kind of lean on that. But, back to the question, generally speaking, I think if you look at our shortlists for the last couple of comps, there's a variety there. We've had Dean Corey's entry in the last comp and Greg Schmidt's entry in the first one. Both very comedic, very light stories, but also very good stories.
Yeah.
And we've also had, similarly, much darker stories come through as well. So I don't think you're ever competing on genre so much as, is there an emotional reaction from us?
Yeah.
I mean, we have to like it. We have to feel something when we read it, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I would never say, oh, that story made me feel bad, therefore it's not getting through. If it made me feel bad, that's great. Like, you've made me feel something. I'm now highly rating that story.
Yeah, absolutely. So as a follow-up to that question, do pieces ever really shock or shake you? I would say this time around, despite the fact that I've just gone ahead and said they were a bit more subdued and quiet this time, there was a couple that shocked me. So there was one quite graphic story that really hooked me this time because it was so graphic and violent.
Yep.
And then there was another story that was quite shocking from like an ethical standpoint. And I have to say, they do make you sit up and pay attention.
Yep.
Sometimes it can work in your favor. Sometimes you've got to work hard to overcome what might be discussed.
Yeah.
You know? So yeah, again, like, I'm happy to be disgusted and be shocked, but I have to feel like satisfied in the story.
Yeah.
You can't just disgust me for the sake of it. Like, I have to sort of have some sort of like thought process around that or some sort of conclusion that I'm drawing about that disgust. I can't just like have a reaction. It's not enough.
No, completely. You have to have a reaction to the story and not just to the subject matter that's being discussed.
But we do get shocked, and I welcome those stories. Like, go nuts.
Yeah.
Go nuts, please, because this is your safe space to do that. But again, like, make sure you got a point. You're not just giving me nightmares for no reason. Oh, and separately, Alicia wants to know, are there any plans for a Not Quite Right anthology?
I would say there are no plans, but there are thoughts, there are ideas, definitely. Yeah.
I think there's an opportunity for that down the track. So
Yeah,
I don't know,
absolutely.
stay tuned. Okay, so final question for now. So Jaden Christopher on Instagram commented, I like hearing the stats. I'd love to hear those sooner than the long list. So apologies, Jaden. Here we are.
Yep. Well, you'll hear all about them very shortly.
Very, very shortly. He said maybe some of your favorite words or use of the prompts. Absolutely. We're about to get stuck into that right now.
Well, thanks, Jaden, for that segue into the next section of this episode, which is our shout-outs. And let's start with actually our favourite titles.
Yeah, so these are the titles, I guess, that grabbed us when we first saw them. So I'll just read a few of my faves out. That's What She Shed by MT Christian. I liked as well that sort of linked back to the always use said anti-prompt. So I was a bit intrigued about what that might be about. I liked You Have Been Warned by Robert Fairhead. It's very threatening already before I start reading. And then just for the randomness factor, I liked Does a Happy Family Smell Like Fish? By Hannah Gronka. It just mildly blew my mind, I guess, that one. I was like, what is this going to be about? Then Reader Discretion Advised, Coarse Language and a Strong Sex Scene. And that's from our past winner, Athena Law. That definitely grabbed me. And I have to say that the story then went on to grab me. So yeah, those are my faves. And then one that maybe, well, definitely didn't grab me at first, but which I came to appreciate after reading the story was Tiger by Jenny Cleland. So that title, very simple, Tiger, right? But by the end of the story, that sort of took on a new meaning and added meaning to the story. And I really appreciated that. I think that's like sort of a next level skill to come up with a title that does that. So I just wanted to call that one out because I really do think that's clever.
Well, I'll give you a few of mine, and there are many more on this list as well. The Mandate by Bron Morrison, just a nice little pun. And also using our prompt word for the round.
So when you say mandate, then it's man-date,
man-date, yes, to be clear. Unsay Anything by Chad Frame, who came second in the last round of the comp. And that ties back very nicely to the content of the story, which is about things being unsaid, and also is a reference, of course, to our anti-prompt. Wieners Unleashed by Ella McAuliffe. I mean, that gets your attention, doesn't it?
So Ella was our wild card, one of our wild cards last time. So these names are popping back up again. So well done, guys.
Yeah, sure are. And the fourth one, Right On by Lisa Vertical, and obviously being a reference to our little tagline for the show. So thank you, Lisa. And finally, The Incredible Match, and that's Ink with a K by Ruth Lord. And that's a story about an octopus. But yeah, plenty more that we could add to the list.
But yeah, once again, I'd recommend for those of you who will be entering the next comp to check out that Level Up article about choosing a killer title, because it can really set the scene and grab our attention before we even begin and get us on the right foot, I guess, to enjoy your story. And I definitely think that some people could spend more time with their title. We've discussed it before. It's not necessarily so important, but it's just that next step, right? If you've got the time to just add a bit more flavour, a bit more spice. So if you did run out of time with that and, left it to us, like by all means, like it's not the most important thing. But if you are considering shopping your stories around, then maybe have another look at your title before you do.
Yeah. All right, let's look at opening lines. I've just got a couple that I'm going to shout out. The first one is also a good title, That's What She Shed by MT Christian. And I believe I said on the last Longlist episode, if you want to get Amanda's attention, just title your story Fuck Men. And that happens to be her opening line, Fuck Men. Fuck every last goddamn one of them, fucking assholes. So it got my attention. I'm sure it also got your attention, Amanda.
You felt threatened by that one.
Yeah. And my second one is actually one you've already called out, and that's Don't Fuck With Chase, who had the opening line of fuck, 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 which is definitely memorable.
Yeah, for sure. So I've gone a bit higher brow than you do
have you?
this time. This is a few lines, but one I really enjoyed was Bite Sized by Arabella Peterson. And so I'll just read the opening of this story. On the rare occasion I meet with someone from an app, the tension burns a hole in my chest. There are too many chances to miss a cue or make a mistake. But tonight, it's mechanical. We're strangers on the same conveyor belt. Success is a numbers game. And what I really loved about this is that it really established a sense of character very quickly. And
Yep.
I think that's something that I'd really recommend a lot because once we've got a character, we can sort of follow a story. So that one definitely grabbed me.
Yeah, that's a great one.
Then we have I Would Always Choose You by Melanie Mulrooney. And the line is, last night I dreamt we were lobsters.
Yeah, that's one with a great opening and a great closing.
So I was just getting Colin Farrell lobster vibes off that one. What's the movie called again?
The Lobster.
Oh, the Lobster. Great title. And then we had A Date in the Sand by Frederick Dios. They had taken our boots when they left us out here to die. So the sand scraped our bare, blistered feet as we trudged on. Just very visual.
Yeah.
Then we had The Choice by Daniel Clark Mudge. And the opening line is, Michael stepped into a sea of purest white. The white had neither shape nor form, yet it filled his vision entirely, punctuated only by a single table.
Yes, I remember that one.
Very visual. And finally, the last opening line I wanted to call out was from Fourth Time's the Charm, ? By Fiona J. Kemp. And the line is, Diana and Kathy arrived early to La Petite Mort, a 1 Michelin star French restaurant that just opened, whose byline said the food was orgasmic. So not that highbrow, but so Le Petit Mot being French for orgasm. Anyway, what I really liked about that one was that it just set a scene really quickly and set me up to have a good time, so to speak. Maybe not that good of a time.
Okay, so let's look at the prompts then, starting with our word prompt for this round, which was date.
I think always as a competition entrant, it's interesting to know, like, was my idea original? You know, I do think date, like, we chose it for a reason. It's an easily hidden word as well. So I found it much less confronting. I don't know if you agree, where punch sort of stood out a bit more.
Definitely, yeah.
And right certainly stood out a bit more. Date tended to fade into the background.
And date also can be included in a lot of longer words, much more than punch.
And it was. And we'll see a bit of variety here. But I just wanted to ask you, can you have a guess what the main usage of the word date was?
So there were two main options. One is being on a date or talking about your date in relation to being on a date.
Yeah.
And the other one would have been a calendar date. But it was fairly split between those two. I would say like more in favour of being on a date.
Yeah. So I've called this category romantic date, right? So some reference, whether it was, and there was plenty of first dates, there was lots of blind dates, and there were a lot of speed dates, as you might imagine. Yep. There were 68 stories that included some sort of romantic date, and that was the usage of the word. And in fact, there were a few more that included dates, romantic dates, which didn't actually use the word date in that way and used it in some other way, which I thought was interesting. Now, when I say romantic date, I do have to be clear, they weren't all romantic, right? So some were ironically referring to a date, like, hey, it's a date, when it wasn't really. But I've just lumped it into that same category because that's the meaning of the word. And there was also one, date rape. So again, I've lumped it into that category, though I'm sure we can all agree that is not romantic.
Yes.
But yeah, then second from there comes calendar date. So there were 56 stories that used some sort of calendar date. So as you might imagine, there were a lot of important dates referenced. So we had due dates, birth dates, wedding dates, death dates, some dates of execution. So all of these I've put into the category of calendar date. And again, that was a great deal of variety. So if you've used that, then it's possible that you had quite a creative take on that calendar date, you know, or that you let it fade into the background. Those are both very valid choices for the prompt. After that, our highest chosen date word, where date was included in a longer word, was candidate. And we'll see that quite a bunch of stories were sort of based around an election.
Yeah. I'd also say inundate would have come up a lot as well.
Yeah, inundate, sedate or sedated. So all of those were fairly common. And then we had date as the fruit. So we had sticky date, we had date palms, which are the trees that grow dates. Then we had dilapidated, outdated, a whole bunch of different ones. Intimidate, mandate, as you've indicated, also mandate with a hyphen, date between two men. And then some others, validated, update, up to date, out of date, all these sorts of things. Now, there was one character called Date.
Yep.
And there were two horses called Date. One was called Date and the other was called Save the Date. And then there was a company called Ready Date. There were only 2 dates with Destiny, which I was a bit disappointed about.
There's a couple of little cliched phrases that use the word date, like date with Destiny and up to date is another one.
Yeah, so we had 3 up to dates and then we had 3 that were either like out of date use by date or sell by date. It sort of depends where you live and how you describe things. Now, interestingly, we had 2 usages of the word lapidate.
Yes.
Now, I had to Google that because that's fortunately not a word I'm familiar with because it means stoning.
Stoning, yeah.
So
I looked that one up as well.
all right. Now, I just wanted to give a special shout out to Nikki England, whose story Unnatural Selection. Well, let's let Nikki speak for herself. So in her brief explanation field, she said, I may have overused the prompts. The word date appears 12 times.
Yep.
There are 4 candidates and I've only used said once. So well done, Nikki. But Nikki also went on to say, I had to delete the word ultra-crepidate. However much I loved it, it just didn't fit. And I didn't know what that word meant either. It means to venture beyond one's competence or purview. Mm-hmm. So it's a word I should know and use often at work. Yep. But I have to say, Nikki, good call to leave it out, honestly, because as much as it's fun to play with words, sometimes it can harm your story if you're putting in words that don't fit. So good call. Some people might be interested to know that they were the only one who used a certain word. We've only got 1 play date, which is well below average for play dates. 1 liquidate, 1 accommodate, 1 usage of datelessness, which they've used in reference to like going without dates, but is usually used to mean timeless. It can mean both things. We had 1 desperate and dateless ball.
Yes, I remember that one.
And here are some words that, again, I had to Google, all right? I don't know if you know them. We had depredate.
I do not know that one.
No, so that means to lay waste, plunder or ravage.
Yep.
Great words, by the way. Caudate.
I think I looked that one up. What is...
Well, I love this one. It means heart-shaped.
Heart-shaped,
How
yes.
How cute. Oxidated.
Yes, yep.
Yeah, so, I mean, technically it means combined with oxygen to form another substance, but typically it's going to be rust, and it was rust in this case, so rusty. Mithridate.
Oh, I remember, I think I looked this one up or got it from the context. What is it?
An antidote against poison.
Oh, that's right, yes.
And it's usually used in a mythical context, although it's not spelled M-Y-T-H, it's M-I-T-H, mithridate. So like just sort of this mythical cure-all to all poisons. Yep. I enjoyed this one, regurgitate.
Yep.
Which has been defined within the story itself to mean someone you go out with who makes you throw up in your mouth a little.
That's very creative.
Yeah, good fun. And I was very shocked, some might say disappointed, to find that there was only 1 date in reference to a bumhole.
Yep. Very disappointing.
Very disappointing. And then this was a fun one, another one that made me Google, Datemi un martello, which is actually a song, a 1963 Italian banger by Rita Pavone.
And it's Italian for give me a hammer.
Give me a hammer, right? Yeah. But these are the opening lines, and this is why I love it so much. Give me a hammer. And then someone else asks, what do you want to do with it? She says, I want to hit my head with it. Hit whoever I don't like. Yes, yes, yes.
and this was a hit song as well, because I did look it up on YouTube.
Yeah. And I would like you to play it for our listeners, because now I've decided this is now my new mental hold music.
I love how the film clip, she's just kind of wielding a hammer, dancing around.
Oh, to be Rita Pavone, living the life with a hammer.
All right, let's go into the next prompt, which was our action prompt, picking a winner.
So I have to say, there were a couple that were a bit dubious on this one, or I was dubious of the entries that they didn't really clearly cover this prompt. Now, we are pretty open with it, and we do say, like, as long as it happens, it can happen sort of before the story or after, but it needs to be clear that there's some sort of winner being chosen. And so, I don't know, somewhere a bit borderline, but we'll go through some that were...
I think for me, as long as someone got picked for something...
Yeah.
Or
but
something
this is what
got
I'm saying.
picked.
It wasn't necessarily, and they may have justifications for that, but I would say we're probably not going to exclude it on the action prompt because it is hard to disprove, but I definitely value it when I see that it's been handled in a creative way. Yeah. So the more you engage with it, I think the better. So I'm going to ask you again, what do you think was the main usage, just generally speaking, of the type of winner that was getting chosen?
A lot of the time, obviously because of the word prompt, it was a date or
Yeah.
like a partner.
Yeah, a romantic partner. Choosing a romantic partner by far and away. And I don't have the numbers for this one. But then we had a lot of gambling too, as you might imagine. And I think our image that we sent
horse,
out with the horse, I think inspired a few stories. So we had a lot of horse races, but we had all sorts of things, raffles, bingo, all sorts of things that were being gambled on.
In fact, I commented to you that there were quite a lot of baking/cooking competitions happening.
Bake-offs, county fairs, that was a big one that we saw a lot of. There are a lot of martyrs or victims being chosen, like murder victims or martyrs. That was a common one. Elections was a big one. So, and candidate was the word that often came along with those. We had battles like sword fights, other types of battles, sort of fight club style battles. And then we just had a huge variety of different types of competitions as well, like huge variety, different races, like running races, reality TV shows. There were a few bake-off reality TV shows. There were a few dating like blind date style reality TV shows. There were some writing competitions. So a huge amount of variety there. And this prompt did seem to lend itself to more variety this time around, I felt.
Yeah. No, I agree with that.
We had some auctions. We had several where a favourite child was being chosen or indeed an embryo to implant. So lots of children being chosen over others. Choosing what to wear was another one we saw a few times. I was surprised only a couple of noses were getting picked.
Yes, yeah.
Because pick a winner, if you're not familiar with English, that's a bit of an idiom.
Yeah,
pick a winner.
Is it an Australian
pick
one,
your
or
nose.
is it international, or like Australia/UK, or is it sounds like an Australian slang, but it could be
Are
UK
you
as well.
casting aspersions on Australians?
Oh,
And we pick our noses. It is dry here. And then we had one character called Winner who was chosen for something. Now, some very oddly specific themes, very oddly specific, that you will be shocked to know that you weren't the only one to come up with this idea. We had 2 lesbian princesses choosing suitors.
Yeah.
2 of those. And then 2 deaf characters choosing a pet. So we had quite a few that were choosing a pet, actually. Well, a handful that were choosing a pet. But 2 deaf characters choosing a dog. And in fact, what was interesting was that they were in the same batch that I read. So there were a few stories apart. And I was like, what is happening? But they were lovely stories. So, you don't have to be original. And in fact, they do say there's no such thing. But I just wanted to call out a few creative takes on the picking a winner prompt. So this was one of the shocking ones that I mentioned before, Speak No Evil by Jamie Gill, where the winner was choosing a lucky straw, but it was to get your tongue cut out. So that was quite a violent, shocking story, that one, and definitely a memorable one. Then we had Shlomo Tries Again at the annual Treasury Secretary Earthworm Performance and Cosplay Pageant by Galen Gower. I just like the idea that there was an earthworm performance and cosplay pageant.
Yeah.
So cute. Reminds me of that little tiny worm on Sesame Street.
Oh, yeah.
And then this was one of your favourites for the title, Wieners Unleashed by Ella McAuliffe. And it was a dog show, of which there were a couple, but it was called Pick a Wiener.
Yeah,
and
very
I thought
cute.
that was cute. So nice one, Ella. Okay, now before I said some were really borderline and I wasn't sure if a winner was picked. Now some were borderline, but it was still clear that a winner was picked, if you know what I mean. Like it was subtle, but it was clear. So we had My Fair Lady by Last Minute. That's the pen name, where they were talking about a movie, which was an award-winning movie. So that movie had been picked as a winner in the past and the movie featured. And I will say thanks to Last Minute for including that detail in the brief explanation field, because it does help when you're going with a subtle take to give us that extra context. And then we had He Said, She Said by Ben Daggers, who had a photo that featured in the story where someone was holding a trophy. And again, Ben called this out in the brief explanation field, but someone won something before and they're holding a trophy and that's totally acceptable. So that's an interesting way to feature it without having to like make a big thing of it in the story. We had Serving the Community by Judith Wilkinson, and that was a competition for Best Murderer. So congrats to the winner.
Very creative takes there.
Yeah. We had Betrayals by Patrick Spiker. And this was a flip of a coin to see who would break the news to the wife that she'd been cheated on. I just thought that was an interesting take. We had The Single Parent's Guide to Leveling Up Your Teenager on a Budget by Jade and Christopher. And that was a memorable story for me. In this story, parents were gambling on their children's growth spurts.
Yep.
It was a very unusual situation, and it was a really like a bizarre sort of story, which I did appreciate. Then we had Send in the Harpies by Holly Sadowski. And the competition was who can lure the most sailors to their deaths. At least that's what I gathered.
That wasn't a memorable one too, yeah. Yep.
And finally, we had Finding Relief at Tropo Springs by Morgan West. And this was the winner of an expenses mostly paid trip to Oz, which I loved. And it's another memorable story and very charming story set in Australia with some good laughs in that one.
So let's go on to the anti-prompt now, which was this time around always use said.
Or break the rule.
Break the rule, always use said, which I think is a very challenging anti-prompt. I think they're all the anti-prompts are meant to be challenging and also meant to be an educational opportunity. And as we say, the anti-prompt is a challenge, not a license, because we're asking you to break a rule that is there for a reason and when applied will generally improve your writing. So what we ask you to do with the anti-prompt is to understand the rule, number one, and then find a way to break it in a creative way that doesn't create the same problems that the rule is there to avoid.
Yeah, we want you to become the exception that proves the rule, right?
I think this time around with always use said, there's probably a bit of a misunderstanding about what I guess the rule really is alluding to, because you can follow the rule always use said and never use the word said in your story. That is.
And we did see a bit of that actually. Yeah. So I would say some people... Is fail too hard a word? Failed on the anti-prompt this time around.
Yeah. So I think, again, we have to be quite relaxed in our interpretation and reward, I guess, the effort and not always the outcome.
It was clear that everyone was engaging with it. I will say that. Everybody was engaging with this challenge. And there is an article in the participant lounge about always use said and the rule and why it's there. So Kieran Gould Dowan, who's one of our participants, said in their feedback...
Exclaimed,
ejaculated. I didn't even know about the always use said rule until today. I was still using other descriptive words.
It's a rule that you really should know.
Yeah, it is. It's important. So do you want to share with us like a bit of a gist? We've got the article there, but just a brief overview of what does it mean?
What the rule is saying is basically when you have a dialogue tag, you should always use said. He said, she said. So it doesn't mean that you should always accompany your dialogue with a dialogue tag, but when you do, it should be said.
Yeah. So, and I mean, in real life, maybe not always, right? Yeah. Sometimes there are some exceptions. And so some that we did highlight in the article were some of those more straightforward verbs like asked or possibly yelled or things like these that provide a little bit more context to the dialogue, but do so in a way which isn't in your face.
Yeah. I think the criticism or what the rule is there to avoid is distraction from the text, especially when writers put a lot of adverbs into their dialogue tags or even one adverb. That can kind of give your dialogue a very cartoonish feel, like he replied snidely. I think those kinds of tags are to be avoided generally at all times. For sure.
That's exactly what this rule is about. And as you said, it's about avoiding distraction. It's avoiding taking the reader out of the story in a way that reminds them they're being told a story instead of being in the story, if that makes sense. If they're so engaged in a story, they forget they're being told a story. That's like ideal. So I think one of the main reasons this rule is shared with new writers is that writers love words, right? We all love words and we love those creative words. I've just learned some new ones today, like chordate means heart-shaped, but I'm unlikely to use that in a story because it's potentially, and I'm not saying it was in these cases, but it's potentially distracting because it's not a word that is natural to me, being a word I've never heard until now, right? And same goes with some of those dialogue tags. If you're using these really creative ways of describing the speech, you know, it feels fun to do, but as a reading experience, it is actually distracting. And what is more effective is to make your dialogue so compelling that A, I know who's talking, you don't even need to tell me because I get it by the way that they're speaking. But also I get a sense of their tone when they're speaking. I know that they're yelling. You don't even have to tell me.
Yeah. It's almost a sub-rule of show, don't tell. Right? Because if you're able to convey your character's behaviour, it's much more effective than trying to impart their emotion in a single word, right? If they're angry and your reader knows that they're angry, then they know that they're shouting, or that they can understand in their mind, they can picture how they're behaving. You don't need to say, he shouted. And if you're finding that you need to say, he shouted, to convey the emotion of the scene, then it might be time to look at your scene and say, well, how can I better convey the emotions that are in this scene?
Absolutely. So that comes back to where I think there might have been a little bit of a misunderstanding in the comp. So some people have interpreted the challenge to break the rule, always you said, by saying, well, I'm just going to drop dialogue tags.
Yep.
Well, in fact, that's part of always you said. Always you said also, as a part of that rule, is saying don't use a dialogue tag at all if you don't need it. This is about simplification. This is about bare minimum when it comes to attributing dialogue, right? But also another one is using action beats instead of a dialogue tag. So instead of he said, you're now just jumping straight into describing the fact that he's storming around the room, for example, rather than saying he said and then describing what he does. That's part of always you said. Again, simplification, leaning into that description and that imparting of that story in a way that makes it feel very immediate, as opposed to like transcribing what happened. So again, if you were using all action beats instead of dialogue tags, that's still part of always you said.
Yeah, but that's following the rule. And it's also good writing. I mean, that's the kind of thing you should be trying to do.
That's it. And so we certainly didn't exclude any stories that did those things, because technically they didn't use said. So, you know, you did technically and literally tick the box, so no problem. And also it was clear that you were engaging with the story. But I hope that that exercise showed you, if you weren't aware already, how that can improve your story. And if you are the type of person who tends to lean on those more creative verbs to describe dialogue, that maybe you can sort of practice and see what the difference is when you take some of those away. Now, one thing that does break the rule, always you said, is those creative verbs, right? That's exactly what it's trying to avoid, right? So
croaked is one, like he croaked, or
whispered. I mean, again, I don't mind whispered occasionally because sometimes that's necessary. It's just a very simple one that's unobtrusive. But we did get some really creative verbs, and some of those were handled really well, and some of those were done in a way that felt maybe a little bit more clunky, and part of the reason why this rule exists. But if you did use more creative verbs, then that's absolutely a way of breaking the rule. And we'll get to it, but some people did that in really fun ways. One thing that I found surprising was that I didn't mind the creative verbs too much. And I think that's part of the fact that this is flash fiction. I think if it was novel length, I would probably be getting frustrated. But I did find myself not noticing that these creative verbs were being used a lot of the time. And so I would say there might be a little bit more scope for, this is what I've learned, a little bit more scope for those creative verbs in flash, because you are trying to sometimes achieve a visual very quickly. Sometimes you have to take those shortcuts to get to something else that's more important, like to just really be clear and get through that, and then now I can give you the scene and the beautiful imagery.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a little bit more leeway in flash fiction, that you do have a little bit more opportunity to be creative and to play with things a bit more in that way. I
think it's almost a little bit more expected that the language might be a little bit more flowery at times than you would maybe allow in a novel. So Sarah Corey, who was one of our participants, said in the feedback form, I do wish the anti-prompt were a bit more compelling. The only use said rule is one that's already broken frequently by writers. So Sarah was a bit disappointed by this anti-prompt, feeling maybe it didn't spark any creativity. Well, Sarah, I think we're about to blow your mind, because the vast range of creative takes that people had on this prompt was, to me, very inspiring. And so I hope maybe you'll challenge yourself here to think of things maybe a little bit outside the box.
And I would encourage listeners and entrants to read the article WTF is an anti-prompt, because that has some insight into different ways you can break these rules. And I will say that it's not always literal. I mean, again, we talk about the spirit of the anti-prompt, and some people had creative takes that were, I guess, lateral interpretations of the anti-prompt.
Totally out of the box.
Doesn't mean...
Out of pocket, as the young people say.
Yeah, that's right.
Absolutely. Before we get into the creative takes by our participants, Athena Law, our revered winner of the January comp, she said, I'd love to know how the judges would have tackled the anti-prompt had they been able to participate. So how would you have tackled this anti-prompt?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this earlier, and I always go back to a story that we received in the first Not Quite Right prize round, which was Back My Bridge Summer '08 by Emirata Burkle. And the anti-prompt at that time was avoid adverbs. And the way that this writer handled it was to introduce one adverb, but make it something that was a standout, something that enhanced the sentence, something that was unexpected.
Mm-hmm.
It's very difficult to say how you would handle it, because always the anti-prompt has to work well within the story that you're trying to tell. So obviously you come up with a concept of your story, decide what you want to write about, and see how you can work these ideas into it. But I think the most straightforward, and if I was interpreting this literally, that's the way I'd go about it. Stick to the speech tags and then find a way where using a different verb actually enhances the story. And maybe is surprising, and maybe it stands out.
Yeah.
And there were a couple of stories I think that did do just that.
Well, I'm very surprised by your answer there, because given your previous Get Wrecked recommendation, JR, I just pictured you just completely going like out of left field. It's going to be all dialogue, no dialogue attribution. Good luck.
Yeah. Well, it has to be said that JR also followed the rule. And there were a few entries that did also take the same approach, where they just presented a lot of dialogue, maybe one or two words or sentences of other description, but just all dialogue and no tags.
Yeah,
that's one
we
way
did
people
see a
did go
bit of
about it. So how would you interpret the prompt?
See, I was thinking about this, and honestly, when we first decided it, I didn't know. Like when we were choosing this anti-prompt, and I did think to myself, how would I handle it? I don't think I spent enough time reflecting on it, because I didn't have an answer at that time of how I would have handled it. And of course now it's cheating, because I've seen how everyone else has handled it. If I'm being really honest, I think I would have failed to submit. I think I would have just creatively hit a brick wall. I mean, I think if I did enter, it might have been an uncreative take. It might have been something like, oh, I just did it once, or I dropped the tags, or something like that. In fact, I think I would have been at high risk of misunderstanding the anti-prompt and just, for example, dropping all dialogue tags, which, as we've just established, doesn't really break the rule. I might have done that, honestly, if I'm being honest. So
I mean, I guess the thing to emphasize, because like you've pointed out, there's a risk there that people will see that and think, oh, that's too big an ask for me to work through. What we're looking for, again, the anti-prompt from our perspective is an educational opportunity. Like, how do you improve as a writer? It's by understanding these rules, what they're there for. And you don't need to come into this with I've got to come up with a groundbreaking way of breaking the rules of writing and come up with something entirely unique. Not everyone's going to be able to do that. It's an impossible ask.
Like, as much as I'm about to go into some really creative takes here, it doesn't have to be that.
Yeah.
If your story is a good story, that's actually always going to be number one for us. Like, we get the thrill out of seeing these creative takes. And sometimes it does bump a story up in consideration because we can see that they've taken a creative take. But ultimately, it's going to come back to that story quality as well. So sometimes it is going to be like just a brush over, like we just tick the box technically, and that's enough. And that's perfectly fine as well. So I'm going to go through some of the more common creative takes. So one that we saw a few times, but which when I first saw it, I was like, oh, that's a good idea. So this would have been the idea I stole from someone if I was participating in this competition. But that was to use animal sounds instead of human sounds. And so we had quite a few stories that did that. And
I've got two here actually on my list. It's Raining Cat and Dog by Trina High and The Animal Vote by Alicia Rourke. Did you have any others?
Yeah, Waiting for Greg by R.C. Barajas also did the same thing. And they all handled it slightly differently, but I did think that was a cool idea.
I thought it was clever too.
We had Trifecta by Matthew Peters, which was all horse sounds specifically, but they were attributed to a person in the context
that was quite creative too.
And there were horses
and it was
involved in
it
the
was
story.
a gambling addict, right? So they're betting on the races, and someone's observing them making the same kinds of sounds that a horse might make. So that was very creative. Again, linked into the character, linked into the plot.
Yeah, so a bit of subtext there implying that maybe they're a bit too involved in their little hobby there. We also had, and it's one you called out earlier, The Incredible Match by Ruth Lord, which was in fact an octopus communicating through chromophores, which is not something I was familiar with, but apparently this is how octopi communicate with each other, through the colours. And I just think that's really cool.
Yeah, very clever.
I picture Ruth Googling that one and then landing upon that as a form of communication. It may be something she just knew already, but anyway, I thought that was fun. We also had Traveling Glue Stick by Anne Wilkins, where it's a snail, but it's communicating through its actions. For example, I'll just read a line. Betsy wakes up with her grey body squeezing out of her shell and her antenna poking up one at a time as if she's saying, "Why'd you wake me?" So as if she's saying, right? I thought that was clever. And then finally in the animal sounds category, we had Saying is Believing by Robert Tateson, which was a really interesting one where there was a court and the judge was ruling that a parrot wasn't capable of saying anything because it implies conscious understanding. And there were lawyers debating whether this parrot, like whether it was hearsay basically. And I thought that was fun.
No, that's great. Any attempt to incorporate the anti-prompt into the plot of your story absolutely ticks that box.
Yeah, we're always going to enjoy that. Another one that we saw a few times, but which again I was like, oh, damn it, why didn't I think of that? was deaf characters.
Yeah.
Okay, so we had a few deaf characters. We had at the 2011 company annual fundraiser, Some Things Need Not Be Said by Victoria Harris. And these were deaf characters who were typing notes to each other. Yep. We also had Companion by Natasha Rowney using sign language. I think there might have been a couple of others in the mix. So apologies if I missed your story with deaf characters, but there was sign language and body language that were being used there. We also had other types of characters who are unable to speak. So we had The Arrival by Joe, who used creative verbs throughout, but it was also told from the perspective of a baby that was being born.
Yep.
And when the baby was born, it didn't speak, it cried. And I thought that was a creative take. So we had some other characters who were unable to speak. So we had Hush by Sandra Kempen.
And this is the one where the characters were participating in a competition, some sort of contest where they couldn't speak for hundreds of days on end, and they had to write messages to each other on a tablet. That was quite good.
Yeah, it was on a mirror, I think, with a whiteboard marker or something. Mm-hmm. But yeah, interesting take there. We had A Date in the Sand by Frederick Dios, where a character was unable to talk because his mouth was so dry.
Yep.
Had been in the desert for days. And then the extreme end, which we've already mentioned, which was Speak No Evil by Jamie Gill, where the main character only gets to say something once before his tongue's cut out.
Yep.
And then if everybody wants the gruesome ending of that story, his only communication after that comes in the form of blood. He rips out his stitches in his tongue and writes basically help on the ground using his own blood. Like, very creative and shocking take there. Another one that we saw a few times, but from different angles, was death. So death brings about an inability to speak, you might imagine, but from different angles. So we had The Choice by Daniel Clark Mudge, which was the one I mentioned earlier with the beautiful scene setting with the very white setting and just the table. We've got the character of Death in that story who gets no dialogue tags. So, for example, Death's voice travelled across this space like a faint gust of wind, felt rather than heard. Mm-hmm. I thought that was a really beautiful description.
Yep.
We had Teacher of the Year by Cheryl King, which featured a character who's silenced when they're killed, basically. Yep. We had Grief by Leo Reese O'Rin, where the character was talking to a dead person who can't talk back. And then we had With Heart by Molly Wadkins. Now, Molly included some information in the brief explanation, just talking about her experience with grief and how sometimes you don't want to speak. You don't want to have to explain yourself when you've suffered a major loss. And so the idea of someone being able to understand you without having to say the words. And so touched on that idea through that story. And that was one of the deaf pet adoptions. And a very sweet story. Then beyond the characters who can't speak, we had characters who do more than just speak. And this is where some of those real creative verbs came into play. So we had Glorious Summer by Jennifer Bush, which was in the context of theatre. And so we don't just say things in the theatre, right? They're very dramatic. And another example there was Overtired Giggles by Robin James, who had a drag queen character who absolutely didn't just say things and had to use more dramatic verbs to describe how they spoke. We had Life and Death by Sarah Corey, which had one lawyer one-upping the other with more elaborate forms of speech. So we had one lawyer who was just saying things, and then we had the other lawyer who was like going nuts. I thought that was really fun, and I have a background in law, so that tickled me. And then we had This Is Not a Pipe by Nicola Vitucci, where one character says that they're a writer. If they're on a date, I think it's a speed date. One character says they're a writer, and then the other is trying to impress her by using more creative verbs. And that was cute. So we had a few hermit crabs, which we've said before are not our favourite usually, but we have been proven wrong in the past.
Yep.
But we had some hermit crabs where dialogue was ditched altogether.
Yep.
So, and that's a perfectly acceptable way to handle it, right? Just you don't have to worry about using said if you don't have any dialogue. That's totally fine. So we had A User's Guide to Staying Single by Alex Wright. We had Mama's Girl by Jennifer Quayle, and we had Those 5 Words by Rowena Farrant. And in all of these, there was a written format, basically, which allowed the story to be told without anyone needing to actually verbalize anything. Then we had some other examples of ditching dialogue. So we had The Last Library by A.J. Fern, who just dropped dialogue altogether.
Yeah.
So there was just none. It was a normal story, but there was no dialogue. We had Straight Up by Ryan Little, who used gestures, like body language, more so than language. We had Everyone Always Said I'd Be Better Off Without You by Alison Tate, which was point of view only. There was no dialogue in that one.
Yep.
So again, like perfectly acceptable way to handle it. Just drop the dialogue. Very clever. And using that as a creative prompt to then go on and do something a bit different that you might not otherwise do, like just really leaning into the point of view stuff rather than setting out a scene with dialogue between characters. We also had The Infinitely Grateful Ex Mrs. Carl Fisher by Alex Atkins. And in this one, it was mostly internal thoughts. There was one line of dialogue. That one just had an action beat rather than any sort of other dialogue tag. But again, just challenging themselves to go with that internal thoughts rather than dialogue within the scene. Now, we had some people who went down the route of JR and ditched the dialogue tags.
Yep, a couple of those.
Yeah, so we had He Said, She Said by Ben Daggers. We had As Overheard in the Staff Break Room by Carolyn Chouinard. We had Beach Girls by Kevin Sandifer. We had Slim Pickings by Erica Charlotte and Passing Through the Veil by Fee Krausen. So they went really brave and just went, I'm just going to have a story that's entirely dialogue with no action or with maybe one line of action in the whole thing. That's a really brave take and very bold, and I applaud that effort. From there, we had some people who played with punctuation and had fun with that and what that might do to their story. So we had Starship Revelation by Georgia May, who used italics instead of speech marks or dialogue tags. So just using the formatting to avoid said. We had Misadventures in Love and Friendship by Christophe Meixlou, who I think seemed to be having fun with the style. So using italics, different creative verbs, just a bunch of different stuff to sort of tease out the conversation. We had Waiting by Dean Curry, who was 4th in our last comp, who used no dialogue tags or quote marks. So points for bravery there. And it was all like, to me, that's all about like listening. Do you know what I mean?
Yep.
You get this sense that you're listening in a little bit and it feels more natural because in the world, you're not in the coffee shop overhearing he said, she said. You're
That's
just
right.
hearing snatches of conversation. So I think that's one that can feel quite immediate when it's done well. We had Bite-Sized by Arabella Peterson. This was sort of hermit crabbish, this story. So it was a speed dating story and each section was sort of had its header. But then we launched into the dialogue of the person they were on the date with, but the way it was structured just sort of, it didn't need he said, she said.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, now another example of how to use it just simply was the people who just used said once. Right. But they gave it a special meaning. So instead of always use said, they used it once and they used it in a way that meant more than it might otherwise mean. So we had I Love You by Eva Pippa, who used said as an option to convey a lack of emotion compared to other more creative verbs. We had Hello Pumpkin by Heidi Cuvée, who had a character who refuses to say anything about the topic of love. So just really specific to that topic. And then we had Tracy's Mum by A.A. Long, who used the dialogue tags throughout to sort of reflect the character's mental state. And then only at the end do they use said. And that's reflecting the fact that he's finally realised, like he's gone through his thought process and finally resolved it.
Yeah.
And now we're saying things, right? Okay. Now I want to get to some of the really original takes, the one-offs, the ones we just saw once. So I'll just maybe share some of mine and then if you have some that you want to share. Okay. So I had Sunday Birthday by Isabel Winnett, who used a robotic voice instead of a human voice. We had Illicit Affairs by Hannah Groth, who had a character who didn't say what he was supposed to and texted instead. We've all had that in the real world, right? Someone's not brave enough to say it to our face. We had First Round Knockout by Jenna Trelaw, where the words are delivered as punches. And I wondered if Jenna had maybe been listening to the last round and a bit of subliminal messaging there. But I found that one really an interesting take. We had Contestant Number 4 by Izzy Rose, who created a professor character who shared the rule, always use said.
Oh, yeah, I remember this one.
Right? It was quite a bizarre story that I was really on board with. And I hope your professor looks like Jeff Goldblum. That's all I'm going to say. We had Happy Hour by AJ Blackman. And in this story, almost every line of dialogue is met with an internal thought rather than a reply, an out loud reply. I thought that was a cool take. We had The Democratic Method Applied to Cake and the Volatile Mind by the author P. Brain. Great name. So in this story, we had a character who had multiple personality disorder or dissociative disorder, I believe it's referred to now. So this entire story was in this person's head, the conversation between the different personalities. We had I Wish She Were Mine by Nicole Wilson Rogers, which was based on it was a fictional painting within the story, which was titled Things Never Said. And that became the basis of the plot. Yep. So Mum's been doing the dirty and the painter is the character's real dad. Dun, dun, dun. Sorry, spoiler alert. All right. So anyway, I was really overwhelmed by the many different takes on an idea that I had literally nothing for. So well done, everyone. But what did you get? What did you
I had a few more that you did go through a lot, but I'll mention a few that stood out to me.
I was having a good time.
I know. So one that we've already mentioned is I Would Always Choose You by Melanie Mulrooney. This is the lobster one. So I think there was only one dialogue tag in that one, or a couple. You're new here, I rasped. Lobsters can't talk, you replied. So again, this happens in a dream.
Yeah, it works because it's a crazy dream. So it doesn't matter. It doesn't need to sound
It doesn't
sensible.
need to make sense. No, exactly. I liked this one. This is Winner by Kathy Bow. And again, this was only one dialogue tag, but it's sit down, the speaker crackles. And I like that because it was not a voice. It was something else that was speaking. And you wouldn't say the speaker said.
No, but the speaker is unknown. So you're...
Yeah, exactly. So, to be clear,
I mean, the speaker of the
a speaker
dialogue.
on the wall, like, a loudspeaker. So it makes sense. And of course you would break the rule, always you said, in that instance.
Yeah.
So that's a great example, and I like that one. Also, Gender Diversity in Hell by Suzanne Walker.
Great title, by the way.
Just for the tag, he mansplains confidently.
Nice.
There were two stories that I have here that had a character whose name is Said, S-A-I-D. So like in the first comp where we had characters who were named after adverbs. So this time around, we had two characters called Said. So Once Upon a Paper Cup by Aaron Brandt Philiter and Said and Sadie Pick a Date by Sanya Dimova.
Once Upon a Paper Cup, I like that one too because it was a story about like quotation marks, like they were the characters, right? Yeah. So that was super creative take, like completely bizarre. Said worked in a cafe and then the quotation marks come in. And then should I just say what happens next?
Go for it.
They have a threesome.
Yeah. I
just think that was good fun. I hope you had fun writing it. Feels like you did.
It sounds like something Chuck Tingle would write.
Totally. That's a tingler.
It's a tingler. Okay, and finally, Unsay Anything by Chad Frame, which was quite a creative take on the anti-prompt.
Like it was fully inspired by the anti-prompt, the whole story.
Completely.
Yeah.
It's kind of a story in reverse. It describes a series of events unhappening, including characters unsaying things. So very much leaning into the prompt.
Yeah, so Chad's rationale there was basically the opposite of said is unsaid. And so the character is unsaying
That's right.
these things. It was a fabulous take. I will say, and I'll say it till I'm blue in the face. Like I have a lot of time for these creative takes. I love them. It's exciting to read it when I see one that's fresh. But make sure that your priority is a great story.
Yeah, always.
Always.
Okay, so I think that's it for all of the shout-outs. So on to the daredevils.
Exciting.
We've got 5 daredevils this round, which is a lot. for one episode. So we're actually going to split them into 2 episodes. We'll cover the first 2 Daredevils in this Longlist episode and the remaining 3 on the Shortlist episode.
Mm-hmm. Are you quaking in your boots, Daredevils? Are you excited? I just want to quickly say, it's really a vulnerable act to put yourself out there.
Totally.
Let everybody listen to the critique of your story. So right up front, I just want to say you're all very brave.
Mm-hmm.
And, we're not going to be full of just blind, glowing praise. We are going to critique this, because we want the best for you. And we're going to give you some challenging things to think about to hopefully improve your writing.
That's right. The first story is one we've already mentioned, and it's Don't Fuck With Chase by Stuart C. Anderson. And here it is. Fuck. 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 The photo of his wife and daughter flailed under the rearview mirror as the Bugatti skidded to a bone-jarring stop. The acrid smell of burning rubber choked Chase's throat as he wrenched himself out of his car into the night breeze. How long? Chase glared at Dex, the oily man he'd kidnapped and strapped to the passenger seat. Only he could run the AI algorithm. Dex tapped his keyboard with grating deliberation. The remotely triggered Glock secured to the dash pointed at his face. He was scared shitless. Good. How fucking long? It says she'll be dead in 2 minutes. Chase surveyed the dilapidated cabins. Which of these shitholes is she in? More methodical tapping. Chase gritted his teeth. The first cabin. Chase's Beluti boots were already crunching on gravel as he tore towards the cabin. Dex watched the man's silhouette disappear behind the cabin. His focus returned to his biometrically powered AI algorithm, Crime, developed for the Falcone crime syndicate. Enter a name, and Crime's analytical modelling, plus its connection to every online system on the planet, could predict any outcome with 90% accuracy. Would they pay a ransom? How much would they pay? Where best to dispose of the body? Dex trembled as he typed, but he needed to know. Will Dex winner survive tonight? No. Dex gaped at the blinking cursor. Fuck. Cold sweat trickled down the nape of his neck. Chase stood at the rear of the cabin. He pushed the splintered door. It protested, but groaned open after some encouragement. She lay sprawled on the floor, still wearing her Versace zip-up hoodie from that morning. No blood. Sedated. Alive. She opened her eyes. No need for Dex anymore. He flicked the remote trigger switch and heard a muffled pop from inside his car. Harper, it's Daddy. As Dex gargled his last breath from the gunshot wound to his neck, he regretted that his death would be the most positive contribution to the lives of those around him. Chase entered the room. The shadows moved. Who? How the fuck? The gravelly voice belonged to an imposing lump concealed in the corner. Come early to watch me gut your whiny little bitch. Cold steel flickered in the moonlight. The lump fired. Twice. Chase stood firm and dodged the bullets with impossible precision. Harper, close your eyes now for Daddy. Unarmed, Chase strode towards the assassin with an unnatural, bold certainty. The confused lump emptied his weapon. Chase sidestepped each bullet as he advanced. The punch snapped to the man's hyoid bone. He collapsed, retching and wheezing as he coughed up blood. Your trachea is crushed. You'll lose consciousness in 43 seconds. Then you will die. Now who's the whiny little bitch? The AI chip in Chase's neocortex could predict the immediate future with 100% accuracy, based on input from millions of real-time visual stimuli flowing from his optic nerve. Chase cradled his daughter and stepped into the darkness.
So I'm going to start off by saying, great idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is exactly the kind of thing that I could see being the heart of a novel, actually. A great sort of crime, mystery, thriller kind of novel. And we've talked before about how genre stories can struggle a little bit in flash fiction, but you've picked an evocative scene there to take from this genre story. I could definitely see it being teased out to novel length, to be honest.
Yeah, and I think that's probably one of the challenges as well in flash fiction. There is a lot packed into this scene that you need to explain. There's the whole backstory of the AI and how that works. And then you have a secondary character who's essentially got the keys to the AI that's being brought in, as well as the relationships between the protagonist and the kidnappee. And then you've got the person committing the crime. So there's a lot of characters that are kind of being drawn in here. I mean, as flash fiction, it's kind of very difficult to pack all that in and have everyone's story be really fully fleshed out.
Yeah. I do think this felt longer. Do you know what I mean? It felt longer than 500 words. There's a lot going on, which is why I say I think it really would work as in novel length. I like the idea of the Matrix-style dodging of bullets, the use of AI, which is obviously something that's really front of mind for a lot of people right now, and what some of these consequences might be of how AI could go into the wrong hands. So I think you've got a great idea. Yeah, and I'd love to see that fleshed out. But anyway, all right, let's get stuck into the critique.
Okay, and so starting with the opening sentence here, which is just fuck, 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 or the opening 3 sentences, if you will.
3 very succinct sentence fragments.
And it's one that we called out as a memorable first line because it definitely captures your attention. But I think you also mentioned that you need to be careful with profanity and making sure it's used in a way that supports your story. So I would say about this first line is it's an attention grabber. But at this point, we don't really know the context and we don't really understand anything about the character.
Yeah, it's got to be tempered by scene setting. Like as readers, like you say, it grabs our attention, but we also need to drop into the scene. And so that alone won't drop us into the scene. But what I think Stuart did well here was the next line about the photo of his wife and daughter flailed under the rearview mirror. Now we're getting a little bit more about the character and what's going on here. And we're learning about the Bugatti skidding to a bone-jarring stop. Like we're in a hurry, like we're perpetuating that idea of a hurry.
And what I like about this as well, this is something that we've provided feedback on a lot in our critiques, is there's a temptation for a lot of writers to, once you've dropped into the scene, now it's time to provide some backstory about who the characters are, and there's a tendency to take the reader out of the scene to provide that information. So here, Stuart has conveyed the fact that he's married and he's got a daughter.
And we're assuming those characters are relevant to the story.
Exactly. Yeah. And he's done that within the action without taking you out and saying, oh, by the way, this is what's happened to get us to this point, which is great.
We also have a bit more information. We can assume he's probably rich by the car that we're driving here. One thing, and I'm just going to throw this out as a little bit of like a pet peeve kind of thing of mine, which is, and it's something that I'm actually getting more bothered by the more stories I read.
Can I guess? Because this is this the same thing I'm thinking of when someone doesn't name the character?
Yeah, it's such a simple thing, right? So the beginning of the sentence is the photo of his wife and daughter flailed under the rearview mirror. I need to meet him now.
Exactly.
Who just said fuck, fuck, fuck? Who is this person?
Yeah.
I know he has a wife and daughter and I still don't even know who he is. So just a name. Just a name. And a name, we've talked about this before, can convey a lot of information immediately anyway. But it really does help introduce us to that character very immediately, and it gives us something to hang on to because he is quite general. But if we now know a name, we're starting to form a picture.
Yeah, and look, it comes in the next sentence, but I think it really helps really solidify who's our protagonist, what's the situation, just give us a name right there at the start.
And I would say that's a suggestion I would extend to a couple of other things in this story. So we do have some backstory that's dropped in about, or some explanatory information about the AI technology and stuff. Some of that comes a little bit late. So while you just said we don't want to jump out of the story to now have this explained to us, by all means, but I think it's almost like some of it's being obscured. So here's an example, right? We know he's got a daughter, okay? And as the story goes on, we understand that the daughter has been kidnapped. That is a vital piece of information and context setting that does not need to be obscured, I don't think. Unless you're obscuring that kind of vital information for a reason, I say put it right up front. And by all means, don't bore us with a bunch of facts. They need to come in when they become relevant. But I did feel like I was almost having to work hard to understand what was happening. And really, I wanted to just be in the scene and then be drawn into the drama of it as opposed to wondering what's going on.
Yeah, there's a temptation, I think, to want to build the scene up progressively, but there are certain things that you want to get on the table as soon as possible. One of them is who your character is. And the second thing is the stakes.
Yeah.
So as you said, the stakes here, you're trying to establish that the stakes are high by opening in the way that you did. But why not just put them out there? Exactly what's happening in this situation? Why is he saying fuck, fuck, fuck? Why is it such an urgent situation? And the earlier you can establish that connection and get your reader invested in the story, the better.
Absolutely. A couple of little things that I just wanted to call out, but which I think would help potentially lift the narrative here. One thing, again, it's in this first line, as the Bugatti skidded to a bone-jarring stop. Now, there's a few examples of this type of attributing the action to an inanimate object, right? To a car in this case. Or there's another line later on, the remotely triggered Glock secured to the dash pointed at his face. Chase's Beluti boots were already crunching on gravel. Yep. So we're attributing these actions to inanimate objects. I think what we need to do more often than not is make sure the protagonist of the story is doing the action. So it's not the Beluti boots crunching on gravel. Okay, this is Chase crunching through the gravel. And while that's establishing a certain mood and a soundscape, which is great, we need to be very clear throughout that Chase is doing this stuff. So why is the Bugatti skidding to a stop? He's driving it, right? And that's not clear from that sentence. Yep. It's like this car's just wild and there's a photo flailing, but where's Chase in that scene? He's not there.
Where I think this has come from, and probably Stuart is a visual person, and if you imagine this scene as if it was in a movie, you could imagine these kinds of shots happening of the Bugatti skidding or of a close-up of some boots kind of stomping. But even in a movie, you see the boots, but then you see the pan up to the character because it always needs to recenter back into that character. And that's something I think you need to be conscious of when you're writing, that you've always got that character perspective in mind. And when you have a good visual, you find a way to tie that back into the character. Yeah,
because we say this often, that character is one of the most important elements of story, certainly from an engagement perspective. And so, I mean, I love that this scene really reads like a movie scene, and I can picture it and hear it. So that's a strength. But I think to boost it even further, those visuals and those sounds need to be centered around the character and what the character's doing, and not just a soundscape. Like, it has to all come back to the story and the character and their motivations and what they're doing. Now, given that we're saying Stuart's done a great job here of making it feel like a movie scene, which is something I'm often encouraging people in our critiques to do. Like, that's show, don't tell, right? Make it feel like, drop us right in as the reader. We don't want to feel like we're being told a story. We want to feel like we're in the story. And I did feel like I was in this story. One thing that I would suggest to level that up again is to think about filtering. Filtering is like an extra layer that you put on your writing. So I'll give some examples from this story. Dex watched the man's silhouette disappear behind the cabin. This is a point of view shift, and we'll talk about that in a second. But so you're introducing that it's Dex now, and so we need to understand that we've got Dex's perspective. But Dex watched the man's silhouette. I want to watch the man's silhouette. Describe it to me. What does it look like? So I can see it in my mind's eye rather than telling me that Dex watched it. Another example from later in the story. He flicked the remote trigger switch and heard a muffled pop from inside his car. I don't really care if he heard it. I want to hear it. What does it sound like? It's a muffled pop. Okay. Describe it so that I'm hearing it. And the filtering words we often think of are those senses like saw, felt, heard, or thought, attributed to the character. But I, as the reader, want to see, feel, think things, or understand that they're being done without having to have that explained to me.
So I think the idea behind filtering, it comes from the right place, because what you want to do is reinforce the perspective that you've got in your story, right?
Yeah.
So, but you don't do that by adding an extra layer in between your narrative and your reader. And that's what filtering does. It adds a intermediary that everything is kind of filtered through on the page. The way to do that is more directly. And like when something makes a noise, for example, in the story, because you've set up your protagonist as the perspective character, it's assumed that they hear that noise.
So that's close third, right? That's close third POV. If that's something you want to look further into, you can Google that.
And you can take that a step further, even as a narrator, just within your narrative, make comments about things or describe things in a way that your protagonist would see them, right? For an example, if it's like a romance story, you've got a male protagonist and the love interest walks in and you describe it as, oh, she was wearing a beautiful dress and blah, 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 and she looked radiant, whatever description you want to get, you don't have to say, and you shouldn't say, he thought that.
Yeah.
You should just say, she looked.
And just speaking about point of view, there were some sort of scene jumps, some point of view jumps here. And so we're cutting from Chase's perspective to the character Dex's perspective. And Dex is this IT guy, I guess, who's, working with the AI, right? Now, again, I think this comes back to what you were saying before, like Stuart's really describing this in a way that feels like a movie. So you could totally see in a movie cutting back to the car and seeing what's going on with Dex. Now, I'm not convinced that works as well here in flash fiction because while I get that and while I did find that I was quite immersed in the scene, it was also jarring. When you're reading, you're sort of expecting flow and it does take you out of the flow. Generally, and I mean, it's one of those other rules of writing it's called head hopping, right? When you're jumping from that close perspective of Chase and now we're getting the close perspective of Dex. And in a way, it's confusing me as the reader about who I'm supposed to care about.
Yeah.
Who is the protagonist in this scene? It's not clear now because now we've got two.
Yeah.
And while that's something you can absolutely do by all means, and plenty of stories do have multiple POVs, I would argue it's rarely going to work in flash fiction just purely because of the time. We need to really focus in. And if we're focusing in on two characters, it's potentially going to be less effective because we don't have as much time to relate to that character and care about them.
Yeah, and in this story, we step away from Chase for a very short time. We're only in Dex's head for a little while before he dies, essentially. And the effect of taking us out of Chase's head is that we kind of lose focus on what the aim of the story is. Going back to single effect that you love to bang on about, we've now got two stories here, and one of them is, it's a piece of microfiction almost about Dex that you're sandwiching inside this flash fiction story, and you're going to necessarily take away from Chase's story by doing that.
Yeah, and I think you could still have that scene. It's about being creative to find a way to show that, but without needing that POV jump, if you want that piece of information in there. And because it is a scene, there's a few scene jumps here as well, and we do tend to recommend against that as well for the same reason. Like we're in one setting, you've described that setting, and now we've got we're in the Bugatti and we've described that, and now we're in a room. And because of that, I felt none of these settings were fully developed. While I felt dropped in the action, I didn't really feel dropped in the setting. So I think that's a bit of a missed opportunity there. So I think if you can narrow your focus down to one setting, one scene, it allows you to more fully develop those aspects like setting and like character rather than watering it down.
I'll also add just around the perspective shifts and going back to the idea of being visual and looking and imagining the movie play out in your head. When you watch a movie, especially one that is made by a good, competent director, there's other ways in movies that they maintain focus on perspective, and you don't even notice them as just a casual viewer. And so until you start to break down a scene and see where the camera is placed and where the focus is and how that shifts throughout a scene, that you see how directors can shift focus. And in a movie, yes, you do have, for example, there's an action movie and someone's racing against the clock, and they're focused on the protagonist, and then the scene shifts to somewhere else to see what they're up against.
Like the villain or something. Yeah.
But what you won't see is a shift of perspective, and it's a different thing when you're dealing with a camera in a movie. You'll see the other piece of action from the perspective of how it impacts your character. You're not going to go to the villain and then all of a sudden see things from his perspective. So it's important here as well just to keep centered, even if you do go away and describe, here's what's happening to Dex, if you need to describe it, think about maintaining the perspective of your protagonist and not kind of getting into Dex's head.
Yeah. Here's another little one that I see a lot, and I think it's something that comes through more in editing than it does in your first draft of writing something, but it's something that I definitely see when I'm editing or when I'm beta reading someone else's story. And I'll just read the sentence, or the couple of sentences. Chase stood at the rear of the cabin. He pushed the splintered door. It protested but groaned open after some encouragement. Now, can you see what I've picked up there?
Well, anthropomorphizing the door.
Yeah,
for one.
true.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's extends from what I was talking about earlier. But I think there's another opportunity here too, which is that last bit there. It protested but groaned open after some encouragement.
That's a little bit passive.
Oh, you've got another. That wasn't what I was going to say either. Yeah. Okay, listen, Stuart, we hate this sentence because I've got another thing to say about it, which is that it's around the wrong way. Okay, so it protested but groaned open after some encouragement. As a reader, I want to, unless there's a reason not to, I want to read it in order.
Yeah.
So it protested, but after some encouragement, groaned open, right? So I'm watching those things happen in order. If you tell me it protested but groaned open and then tell me it needed encouragement, I am sort of jumping back and forth. And it's such a little thing, but it's an easy thing to change and fix. And I do think it makes for a more fluid reading experience. And that's always something that you want to encourage. But yeah, like you're right. It's a bit passive as well. And it's also like we're working with 500 words here. It's maybe not the best use of those words, like the groaning door. Again, we've got a soundscape, but it sounds almost like slow. Like, you know, we're opening this door and it's groaning open. Like, aren't we crashing the door down, you know, beating the door down? Like, that's the energy we had in the beginning. We're hooning this car in and we're like crunching along the gravel and running and trying to get there. And then we're just sort of groaning open a door. I don't know.
Yeah.
We think there's an opportunity there.
There's always opportunities to look critically at what you're putting in your story and thinking, well, I've got a certain amount of words. Is spending 15 words or so to explain the sound of a door, is that going to be the best use of time of the words that you have?
Like, again, we're in Chase's head, right, in this scene. Is that the thing that Chase is noticing when he arrives? I argue it's not. You know, if I'm running to save my daughter who has been kidnapped from by the baddies and I'm worried she's going to be killed when I find her, is a groaning door that struggles to open the thing I'm focused on? No.
He probably doesn't even think about how he enters the building. He's just in there.
Exploded. And then what does he see? Like, he's exploded into the room. Like, what's there? What's he seeing? I think that's much more immediate. By doing that, by thinking about what does he care about? What is he noticing? Again, that keeps us close to his perspective and allows us to really relate to him more closely and to appreciate the stakes from his perspective.
So actually one thing that I think didn't sit well about this story to me in the next sentence almost is Chase not having any need for Dex anymore and killing him. I don't know why he did that. I mean, Chase is not a bad guy in the context of this story. He's a protagonist. He's trying to save his family. Is there an implied causality between the AI saying he's going to die and the fact that he dies? I don't know if there's a connection being made there, or is there a reason why he has to kill him? That's not clear to me. And I don't know if I'm on board with Chase at this stage as a protagonist. Am I actually hoping he gets his, like, of course I want his daughter to be safe, but at the same time, why is he just killing people who are actually helping him in this situation?
Yeah, and this is where I think this story fits a much longer piece, because that's potentially a subplot that could just be fully developed and deeply satisfying, and even lean into potentially some character flaws that then become really compelling, like maybe he's not just this innocent victim, he's got some other dark side to him. All of that stuff potentially compelling, but isn't explored to an extent that makes it satisfying in this particular short version of this story. Okay, much later in the story, there's a line, the punch snapped the man's hyoid bone. Now, I only know about hyoid bones because of true crime documentaries, and they're usually associated with that's how a coroner can determine that someone has been strangled, because their hyoid bone snaps. And I feel like that's a very specific piece of information that people wouldn't necessarily know. I'm not sure why it gets crushed with a punch, and I'm not sure why Chase knows that the hyoid bone has been like, maybe it's part of this AI and so on that he pictures and knows exactly what's going on. But if I punched you in the throat, I'm not sure that I would be able to determine what damage I did internally to you. That's not a threat. I'm just saying. This is all very hypothetical.
That's true. And it is stated here that he, now that chip is in his cortex, he can predict the future. Maybe there is a connection there, but again, that might need to be made a little bit more clear. We also have the punch being a little bit disconnected from the action there.
Chase
like it's a punch,
punching.
It's not Chase's fist. Or it's not Chase himself doing the punch, it's just the punch. I think with the hyoid bone, writers are often told to be specific in their writing and don't just drink whiskey, drink Jack Daniels. And specificity is an opportunity to develop character and relay more information. But I think you're right in this case, it doesn't develop character.
Well, I think the key
questions.
is, again, what is Chase's perspective? Did Chase see and know that he connected and punched the hyoid bone and damaged it? And maybe he does, in which case that needs to be explained, I think, with the AI aspect. But probably not. Probably, like if I was dealing with the kidnapper of my daughter and I punched them in the throat, my brain doesn't then go on to connect, okay, I've crushed their hyoid bone. Okay, my attention is, are they no longer a threat? Now I'm on to my daughter, you know? So if you can make those little specific details that Chase is noticing that tell us more about Chase, about his state of mind, about what in particular is getting his attention in that moment, I think that's the key. And if you're looking at those details and being specific about those details, that's going to tell us more about Chase. And that's always going to be compelling. One line I did like, though, shortly afterwards, your trachea is crushed. You will lose consciousness in 43 seconds. Then you will die. Now who's the whiny little bitch? And I like that because it was a callback to the line previous. So that's a good, I love that. Callbacks are always great, especially towards the end there, because that's very satisfying to a reader.
Yeah, and so I think especially in the critiques that we've been doing, the ending is often a point of focus and a point of critique, because it's really important in flash fiction that the ending is satisfying and the ending is what the whole story's been working towards. And with this ending, he's found his daughter, he's got her, now he's going to be moving on to whatever the next step is. And we get a view that this is not the end of the story for Chase, right? There's probably some backstory we don't know. You know, where has he come from? Why has someone kidnapped his daughter? Why is he killing someone? And now he's got his daughter. He's equipped with this chip that in the preceding paragraph it's saying, well, now he can predict the future with 100% accuracy. He's got his daughter. He's stepping into the darkness. It's kind of implied that there's a continuing story that's happening after that. So while I think that's a fine place to end it as a little action sequence, I didn't feel that this ending was necessarily the culmination of the story. It didn't conclude. It didn't wrap.
Yeah, nice little bow. Nice little bow.
I don't necessarily want to say that your story has to wrap up in a nice little bow, but I think you should reach the end and say, yes, that was satisfying. I'm satisfied by the whole package. And there are a lot of great things about this story. I think it's very action focused, very active. It's not really in anyone's head. It's all kind of dynamic and on the page.
Yeah.
I would have liked to see an ending that was a payoff for what's happening.
Yeah, and I think like a poignant moment between Chase and his daughter might have helped with that, because she hasn't had a voice and she may be unconscious or what have you, so it doesn't necessarily have to be a moment where she speaks or where they interact directly, but a moment with him and his daughter, a quiet moment where he's like, okay, now I've got her, is probably what this story needed. But I just have bad news for you, Stuart, and that is that you're just going to have to write the whole novel now. Sorry. All right, so let's wrap it up now by talking about the handling of the prompts in this story. Yeah,
so in terms of the word prompt date, we've got a couple of instances in dilapidated and sedated. And we've said, you don't need to do it more than once, but also date is an easy one to just accidentally, through the course of your story, slip in. So that's fine.
Yeah, they were fine.
And they're both good.
And they fit. They fit the narrative.
Exactly. I did like the interpretation of the picking a winner action prompt in that his name was Chase Winner. And there are some winners being picked. I mean, Dex is obviously the loser. And so in terms of the anti-prompt, avoiding the rule of always using said, this is actually following the rule, right?
Yeah.
So Stuart has really avoided a lot of dialogue tags in this writing, and to good effect, because you know who's talking, right? And where it's not clear, he has used just action to describe what's happening.
Which totally fits this style of story. So
exactly. That's how you should be writing.
Keep doing that.
Exactly. Yeah, so it's not really breaking the rule, but
he did actually avoid using the word said.
Yeah.
So, he totally technically ticked that box.
All right. So what were your overall thoughts about the story?
I thought it had promise. I mean, I did think that there were some opportunities there to level it up from a technical perspective. I think probably the main thing I would have liked to see is maybe ditch those POV shifts. Let's just stick in the one scene. But apart from that, like, keep going with that real visual scene setting.
Yeah.
It really suits this genre. I don't know if you normally write in this genre, Stuart, but I hope you do because I think you're doing a great job of it. And I would love to see it as a novel.
Yeah, as I said, I really liked how active and how dynamic the storytelling was here, how visual the storytelling was, and how grounded in the present it was.
Because we're telling people to do that all the time.
All the time.
But thanks so much again, Stuart, for sharing your story with all of our listeners. I hope you all enjoyed it. Who's going to turn it into the screenplay? So, on to our next daredevil, Anna Volbrecht, with Words Unspoken. You came. I winced at my relief, at how quickly those words slipped from my mouth, nearly breathless. We had always been two embers dancing past each other through the updraft, until yesterday, when the universe conspired to put us both on the number 10 train. He by routine, me by happenstance. I did. A drink, we'd agreed, just to catch up. How could we have let so many years slip past us? But mine was the next stop and he was running late, so tomorrow then, a drink. I saw him walk past the pub more than once before crossing the threshold. Even now he looked prepared to flee, but lay down his coat, resolving to stay. Let me grab something. Want a refill? He gestured at the nearly empty pint before me, evidence of my own trepidation, my own eagerness to see him again. I handed him my glass. Sure. Let him buy me one last drink, and I knew this would be the last. Our paths had aligned for this final near miss before we would be flung once more in opposite directions. A snake bite? Your usual? His words came teasing, familiar, as he handed me the fluorescent pink concoction of alcohol and memories. One sip and I was 10 years younger and 10 times more foolish, with an outdated belief in our invincibility. So. We both reached for that same comfortable phrase, hoping the other would pick up the thread. We moved apprehensively, cautious of the lingering what-ifs, as we stumbled between reality and chemistry. How have you been? His redirection was a distraction to keep our feet firmly planted. We eased ourselves into shallow banter, trading frivolous details about the lives we lived without the other. Jobs, travels, friends shared long ago. But we studiously avoided the golden band blazoned on my finger. So. We staved off the thread of silence with another round of drinks and remember-whens. Back and forth for an hour, two, neither of us saying anything essential, until he dropped a sad, kind smile and nodded at my hand. I hope you picked a winner. Someone deserving. Whatever spell had been cast over us splintered, impaling us both. The lights suddenly seemed too loud and the room too tight. I mustered a short, sharp nod and a smile I hoped he read as genuine. He began to shrug on his coat. I've got to run. This was it. We'd reached the end. I'll walk you out. The evening was dusted with rain and the city lights cast false galaxies in puddles. It was stark and mesmerizing, and we leaned into each other for just a beat too long. I loved you once, you know. Our eyes caught. For one brief moment, we were bound together again in the never-to-be, where our friendship had ripened into something more. He brushed my cheek with his thumb, and I laid my hand on his chest. Goodbye. We turned then and walked away. So thank you, Anna, for sharing your story with us. What do you think, Ed?
Yeah, I really like this story, and you can easily understand these two characters. I think it carries a lot of emotional weight, again, just by this situation of there's two people, they haven't seen each other for a long time. There's the instant remembering of what life was.
Yeah, I feel like Anna really captured that well. All those feelings just come flooding back.
Yeah.
It's like you're fine, you're just going about your day to day, and then you run into someone that's like, oof, I'm 10 years younger again. I did think she captured that well, that mood. There were some really beautiful lines, evocative lines in this as well, which is, I think, what contributed to that mood. Like, here's an example of capturing the mood. A drink, we'd agreed, just to catch up. How could we have let so many years slip past us? But mine was the next stop and he was running late. So tomorrow then, a drink.
Yeah.
Like, I just felt that vibe, you know, that conversation. You didn't have to give me everything that they said. I was there. I felt it.
Yeah, I think she does really well to develop this previous connection between these two characters. I mean, the detail of the fact that he remembers her drink, I think is quite effective because not only does it say, well, they had a history, but also it's a history that is very memorable to him, that he can kind of recall that detail in the moment.
There's an intimacy of that.
Yeah.
And also, like, it's a snake bite, right? Like, it's not a Pinot Noir. Like, there's a implication that they were younger and wilder, which is great subtext. It just says so much. Like, you were talking before when we were talking about Stuart's story about the whiskey, like, make it specific. The specificity here actually really adds something because it tells us a lot about the characters and their relationship with each other. Now, I will go back to my pet peeve here, which is, why don't they have names? Who are they? And it's not necessary because it's a vibe anyway. And look, you could argue that leaving out the names allows us all to insert ourselves in here. And maybe that's what you wanted to achieve, in which case that's totally fine. But I do think if you want to establish character connection, then a proper introduction is warranted.
No, I completely agree. I think generally you do identify with characters who are more realistic and complete than leaving them more vague or more universal has the opposite effect, I think.
But I did feel still that I got a sense of character a little bit here, and that was important to sort of hook me in and get me invested in what was happening.
Yeah, I think we did get a sense of really the universals in this story of, you know, that nostalgia and that missed connection maybe. The fact that they were both, you know, almost pining for this past and there was something unresolved there, you know, and that's a universal thing. I don't think there was really too much about each of the characters in there.
No.
It is flash fiction. You're not going to tell the backstory. You're not going to get everything through.
And we didn't need it, I don't think, here. Like, it might have added value or maybe not. Again, maybe the character names wouldn't add value in this case because you want to keep it universal.
I just mean that maybe there were some details that express the characters themselves a little bit more fully and not just the fact that they shared a connection.
So one thing I would suggest as an opportunity in this story is that we had these lines and I felt awkward reading them out loud, which was so ... and then the reply ... Reading that in my head was probably a bit more effective than it is reading it aloud because I'm not two separate voices. This also doesn't help. But first of all, we've dropped dialogue tags here. So I don't actually know who speaks first or who speaks second. But also, so is just nothing. So on its own, like in other ways, like this snake bite and so on, we've got these details where we're getting a more complete picture of these characters. But then when all they're saying to each other is so, I'm getting nothing. Like, I get the awkwardness, but there are other ways to express that awkwardness which might have felt more personal and which might have harked back to an older time in the same way that the snake bite did. While I appreciate, again, that it's awkward, you've gone there twice. Okay, so we've had that exchange twice. And in fact, you emphasize that exchange by saying we both reached for that same comfortable phrase. You're implying that this is something they always used to do with each other. Well, were they always awkward with each other? I don't think so. You've given us a sense that they were once very intimate and now they're not. So a line which held that intimacy again could have also still made it super awkward. If you were suddenly getting really intimate again in your language with someone you haven't seen for a long time, that could also feel awkward, but at the same time contribute to this feeling of the missed connection. So I don't know exactly what you would have included there as an alternative, but just something to consider, that maybe an opportunity to like really leverage more and squeeze more emotion out of it.
Yeah, I think this is a really difficult story to tell in a very active, immediate way, right? Because what's being expressed here is the fact that there is so much unspoken. And the words, if you read the dialogue only in this, it's you came, I did, sure, so. Like there's nothing being expressed in dialogue, almost nothing. Maybe the snake bite is the only thing that kind of triggers something. And that all completely makes sense from the perspective of the story they're trying to tell. It's because neither of them really want to make that first move and expose themselves. And also, it may be too late even to do that. So all they have is that awkwardness between each other. In fact, it is too late. She's got a ring, that's what's going to happen. So the story is about that awkwardness and the fact that there are all these words left unsaid. In fact, the title of the story.
Yeah, so it's clear that that's what Anna was going for there. Yeah. So I don't want to discount what you were actually trying to achieve there. I think there is something to be said about the fact that they're finding this awkward.
Yeah, I agree with you because I had the same thought. And the fact is that when you see those filler words, essentially sure and so and okay, that you would normally just not include in a story. Now, this story really focuses in on them.
And I'm not sure that they deserve the focus. I don't know. Like you could have action beats instead that feel more compelling, which similarly imply that they can't get their words out.
Yeah.
But which would feel more deserving of that attention.
Yeah. I mean, that's the way I felt reading these words. And I hate saying that because that is the concept of this story, but you're still saying the meaningless words and putting those in front of the reader.
Just as an extension of that, there's a line here after the second exchange of back and forth of so. We staved off the threat of silence with another round of drinks and remember whens, back and forth for an hour, 2, neither of us saying anything essential. Now, again, you're harking back to that words unspoken, like the things that you're not saying, but they've said a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
Heaps of stuff for an hour or 2. I would argue that maybe if you tighten this scene up, don't give them an hour or 2, give them a few minutes of awkwardness. His coat's back on in 5 minutes because you just couldn't get the words out. Might have been more in keeping with your words unspoken concept.
I think in the way that you're writing a story about words left unsaid, you want to actually give each word that they do say so much weight and it has to express something very meaningful as subtext.
Yeah, they don't have subtext. So coming at this as like a beta reader, right? And just with ideas. So you, Anna, would have your own clear ideas about what you're trying to express here, I imagine. So what I'm about to say is just like a suggestion. Take it or leave it. Instead of so, for example, we've just established might not be the most effective use there. If you still want to establish that sense of awkwardness and the inability to say what you really want to say, what about, for example, a snake bite, your usual, and the reply is, I don't drink, right? So the subtext there is that a lot has changed since we last saw each other. And now it's super awkward because now what's he going to do with his snake bite? I mean, you've already drunk a beer, so this would change the story a little bit. But then you could wrap the scene up sort of more quickly in a briefer, tighter space of time rather than this we chatted for 2 hours. Now it's like you've shut him down with I don't drink. And now you're trying to say something, he shuts you down, and it's like this connection is just gone. The connection you once had, things have changed, too much has happened. That's potentially a way of handling it. I mean, there's many other ways.
I agree. And I think in doing so, you're also building that tension and the drama.
Yeah. So you're talking about like we're both reaching for that same comfortable phrase. I feel like that's the opportunity here. You're reaching for the comfortable phrase, but it's no longer comfortable because perhaps something wasn't said in the past, right? So let's suggest that the thing that wasn't said, the words that were unspoken previously were I love you. That was not said. So now we've gone and married someone else. And now you wish that had been said back in the day. Like that's sort of what I gather from this. Yeah. So there's that opportunity to weave that more tightly into how they interact with each other now.
That's going in a different direction to this story in terms of the two characters. So that's something to consider. But I think the idea is right.
And, you know, one thing that I also would suggest to people a lot in feedback is like, don't be shy to ramp up the drama. So you've said it's awkward. They're saying so back and forth. What could be even more awkward than that? Yeah. Like give us even more awkwardness. Someone spills a drink on the other person or someone, you know.
Or someone crosses a line.
Someone crosses a line, someone says something that maybe they shouldn't have said and they want to take it back immediately. Like all of these things make for a really satisfying reading experience. You just ramp it up, like just keep twisting until like your characters are really suffering. Yeah. It's also an opportunity with that dialogue to make it more personal to the character. So one thing, you've dropped dialogue tags here. So I need to know who's speaking without needing to be told. So how am I going to know it's the male character versus the female character in this story just by their words alone? And the way it's formatted, just to explain to people who aren't seeing it, all the dialogue is dropped onto its own line without a dialogue tag, which means there's no action beat attached to it either. It could have been the action beat prior, or it could be the action beat in the paragraph that follows.
And sometimes it is in the paragraph.
Yeah, and sometimes it is, but I don't necessarily know that. Like my brain has to sort of do a bit of catch up to know who's speaking. So that's something to just be careful of too.
So what you're saying is to put the dialogue in the same paragraph as the action beat.
I understand that Anna's done that intentionally because of the anti-prompt, but I would say, generally speaking, having the action beat with the dialogue in the same paragraph is how I know who's talking. And if you're not going to do that, then make the dialogue so clear that I know it's the female character speaking without you needing to give me an action beat, because I just get it already.
Yeah. There are a lot of great lines in here and a lot of very evocative lines. How do you feel about the writing and the way that this is described?
I guess I would say it's verging a little bit on purple prose at times. So, and when I say that, like, there's, again, a fine line between what is very beautiful, and I do think that a lot of this is very beautiful, and then what might be considered purple prose.
I mean, it's sentences like, our paths had aligned for this final near miss before we would be flung once more in opposite directions. It's evocative, but it does border on purple in a way. And I'm not sure where that line is.
It takes us out of the story a little bit.
Yeah.
Because now we're focused on the language instead of focusing on picturing what's happening in the scene. If you're being abstract in your language, yes, that can be beautiful. But now my brain is like in the abstract world instead of in the concrete world of what's happening. And it's not filtering as such, but it's creating a layer, like a barrier there between the reader and the story, where we have to sort of overcome that to get back into the scene. So maybe one of the best examples where I think it tips into purple, because I do think it's mostly just beautiful and it does evoke this mood. So I don't want to discourage that. But maybe here's where the line sort of gets crossed. So, whatever spell had been cast over us splintered, impaling us both. So again, an abstract concept, interesting and an evocative way of describing that. But now I'm picturing them being impaled and I'm not sure on what.
Yeah.
And now my brain is like, okay, well, what are they being impaled on? A spell that's splintered. And that's too much for my brain to sort of visualize of these two people sitting in this bar. So making it something that I can actually picture in the scene, using beautiful words to describe something that is actually physically happening in the scene might have been a better choice there.
Yeah.
Because they are beautiful words, right? But just using them in a way that keeps me tied into the scene instead of up here in my head. Because there's no question that you write beautifully. And I think sometimes writers who have that more poetic style, because some writers are really direct already, right? And some have a more poetic style. And the temptation can be to be a bit more esoteric. And I'm not saying that you can't. That's a perfectly valid style. But I would say to those poetic writers, directness, concrete things can actually be poetic too, and don't shy away from them. You don't need to be in the abstract for something to be beautiful. You can describe an object to me in a way that is so visual and beautiful that I feel like I've got it in my hand.
Yeah.
And that's where I think you should direct your skills.
Yeah. And I'd say this as a general rule to anyone writing flash fiction. Avoid describing sequences that happen that are interesting. So saying they talked for hours.
That sounds like weird advice.
Well, no, I mean glossing over them. So they talked for hours and had a wonderful time. That sounds great, you know? Like, tell me about that. Put them on the page.
And, rather than the thoughts. So at the end of this story, one of them, and again, I'm not sure which one, and I think this is a problem, but one of them says, I loved you once, you know.
Yeah.
And so that's the words that are finally spoken. And then we move on to goodbye, and we turned then and walked away. And one thing I wanted to call out about this ending is that Anna has braved a unhappy ending here. I mean, she's going back to her husband, I guess. That's happy for her and her husband. But she's braved an unsatisfying ending in that way. And I like that. I think this story that fit. And it was satisfying in its own way because it leaves us with that lingering feeling of disappointment and missed opportunities. And that's what this story is really about.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I thought that was appropriate for this story. I mean, it is unsatisfying on a level, so...
It could have been more satisfying while still being the unhappy ending as well.
So what would you suggest?
I think to me, it is just that final line, we turned and then walked away, that I think could have had a little bit more impact.
Do you know what? I read this thing recently and it's ringing really loud in my head now with a bunch of stories that I've read, and I'm going to use this advice so much myself in my own comp writing. But I think potentially it applies here. And the advice was, in flash fiction, the story often ends before you think it does. And so one editing trick, if you're feeling like, oh, this ending is just not quite there, it's not quite what I wanted, go back a couple of paragraphs and see if you can end there. Now, I did that with this story.
I think you're totally right.
Yeah, and if this story ended on the line, I loved you once, you know, I feel like that might have been a stronger ending because we're talking about words unspoken, because we're talking about this missed opportunity, rather than the sort of denouement of them saying goodbye and walking off.
Yeah.
If we ended on that kind of that painful moment of finally saying I loved you, that might have been a stronger ending and still leave us with that sadness and that frustration of the missed opportunity, but done so in a way that potentially, I would argue, maybe feels more poignant, especially in keeping with that title. Like it's circular, it links back to that title. That's also satisfying for a reader. So yeah, something to consider.
I do quite like the action in the following paragraph. So just the action of he brushed my cheek with his thumb and I laid my hand on his chest.
Yes, that was...
I do like that moment.
I think that could have come before that line. I loved you once, you know. Yeah. Okay. Here's my little editor brain, right? Instead of that last little bit, and we leaned into each other for just a beat too long, which I would argue is a bit of a show don't tell moment. You've told us that it was a beat too long. Instead of that, bring that other line up. He brushed my cheek with his thumb and I laid my hand on his chest, which is very intimate. And then I loved you once, you know.
Yeah.
And that would have been, I think, a nice, tight, powerful ending for that piece. Anyway, so that's for you, Anna, to determine whether you agree. You may not agree with our determination there. But what did you think about the handling of the prompts?
So the date prompt was the word outdated, which is fine.
Yep.
And the winner that was picked is presumably her husband.
Yeah, so the picked a winner prompt is actually handled in dialogue, and the male character says, I hope you picked a winner, someone deserving, when he finally registers or acknowledges the ring. And what I would say about that is that's perfectly fine, picking the husband, that works. I'd say you probably didn't need to use the language picked a winner. And the only reason I say that is because it stood out to us because of the comp. So outside of the comp, that wouldn't raise any eyebrows. I don't think there's anything wrong with that as a line in this story.
Oh, and the anti-prompt is, and we've touched on it already, that there are no dialogue tags in the story at all.
I would say that I did find it confusing at times. So I do think just that simple action of moving the action beat, the matching action beat, to the same paragraph as the line of dialogue. And I understand why you've done it that way because of the comp, but I do think if you tie the dialogue and the action together, just so we're very, very clear on who's speaking when, who speaks first, who's the one who actually in the end says, I loved you once, you know, like that's important. I really need to know that. So yeah, I would say maybe tweak that if you would consider editing this and potentially sending it out to be published or what have you, that you might want to consider making that more clear. But certainly it was a fine handling of the anti-prompt and it was clear that you engaged with that, and so props for that for sure.
Yeah, I wonder about that line, I loved you once, you know, because it is completely ambiguous in the context who actually said that line. Maybe that was intentional.
It could be.
It doesn't matter who said that line because really that's what they were both feeling, or they were both thinking that at the time, which is an interesting way to do it. So that's a choice as well. Okay, so thank you, Anna, for that story. I liked it. It had a lot of great moments.
I'll say it did make me sad.
Yeah.
So if that's your goal, well done. Thanks a lot.
It's the moment we've been waiting for, the long list. And I just want to reiterate, this was a tough call.
Yeah.
The long list and the short list this time around. We had to draw a line, and there were several that were on the cusp. So if you don't hear your name, don't feel bad. Don't think that your story
They're
was...
totally going to feel bad. Shut up.
Don't think your story was trash and we hated it, because it probably was right on the cusp and you just missed out.
I did actually unfortunately share with our followers on Twitter that there was one unlucky 41st story, which was so bloody close and then fell off. But really what we are here for is the lucky and talented people who did make the long list this time, because it is a celebration whenever you get that little bit of validation, and your stories did stand out to us.
Absolutely. So here are the 40 stories that made it onto the long list for the April 2024 Not Quite Right prize.
Woo!
Third Time's a Charm by Kate Groth. Hot Girl Summer by Laura J. Rain. Bite Sized by Arabella Peterson. The Test by Stephen Huff.
The Rematch by Monique Edwards. 10 by Sarah Percival. I Would Always Choose You by Melanie Mulrooney. Trifecta by Matthew Peters.
A Date in the Sand by Frederick Dios. The Choice by Daniel Clark Mudge. Pick Me by Linda Atkins. First Round Knockout by Jenna Trelaw.
Rhondda Valley, Wales, 1922 by Nick Smith. Survival Guide to Staying Single by M. Lee Gray. Words Unspoken by Anna Volbrecht. The Arrival by Joe. A
Guide to Judging the Pie Entries at the Women's Auxiliary Club Annual Fair from last year's judge Who Should Have Known Better by Sally Simon. Salad Days by Sarah Hurd. April Rain by Callie Poppleton. At the 2011 company annual fundraiser, Some Things Need Not Be Said by Victoria Harris. Unsay Anything by Chad Frame. Attrition by Emily Rinkemer. Happy Hour by AJ Blackman. Grief by Leo Reese O'Rin. Adventure Awaits by Tara Babcock. Out of the Running by Joel Woodard. Mama's Girl by Jennifer Quayle. Everyone's a Winner by Sam James. Blue, Not Pink by Deirdre Lovegren. The Abyss by Aaron Wright. The Infinitely Grateful Ex-Mrs. Carl Fisher, Alex Atkins. Oregon's annual Sea Glass Scavenger Hunt in collaboration with Sillets Bay Glassblowing and the Tourist Board of Lincoln City by Autumn Bettinger. Speak No Evil by Jamie Gill. Hush by Sandra Kempen. I'm Not Sorry by Madeline Howard. Clicks, Ticks, Taps and Time by Samantha Ryan. Down the Garden Path by Tess Allen. Reader Discretion Advised, Coarse Language and a Strong Sex Scene by Athena Law. Late for High Tide by Courtney Danielson. And last but not least, For Two Sticky Birds by Eris Walker. So congrats to all our longlisters. Yes, congratulations. How exciting. And just to reiterate, of that list, somewhere in there is our winner. Mm-hmm. But hey, if you didn't make the long list, there's still a chance you could potentially take home a wild card, because that's not limited to the long list. Yep. So stay tuned. Yeah, and we'll be revealing the shortlist in the next episode, which is coming very soon. So yeah, everyone there's a contender for the prize money. So $1,000 for our winner, 1,000 Australian dollars. And of course, the highly coveted trophy. I got to hold Athena Law's trophy last time around, and it looks really nice in person. So I would be more pleased about the trophy than the prize money personally. Also, it makes for a really good murder weapon. It does. It's kind of pointy and very heavy. It's got real Agatha Christie vibes, I feel. Definitely. But also jump on the forum. It's a safe space to share, commiserate, chat about the entries, stage a mutiny against us. I look forward to jumping back on the forum, actually, because we, of course, have not been on there while the judging process has been underway. Just a shout out to our new listeners, anyone who's jumped on the episode because you were hoping to hear your name today. I invite you to listen to our other episodes where we talk about the writing craft. It's not for everyone.
our banter, but hopefully you stick around and enjoy that too. But also we hope that you'll connect with us and follow us on social media, because there's a lot of stuff that goes on during the judging process. We share some of our insights while we're judging and share updates and things on social media. So it is a good way to stay in touch with the comp and just to know what's going on. And we'd love to share in your progress too. So, you know, we do follow your writing, see where your stories end up. You know, if you do end up finding a forever home for your story that you drafted as part of this competition, then by all means let us know, because we'd love to share that with all our listeners as well.
And as always, our longlisters get a little badge that they can use to boast about their achievement on social media. Previously, we'd emailed those out to everyone, but now you'll be able to download them directly from the website. All you need to do is click the link that will be up in the lounge by the time this episode comes out. And so we're already getting ready for the July round of the competition in amongst all this, choosing what the prompts are and getting all that stuff ready. So the next round kicks off on the 19th of July and tickets are on sale now. So head over to the website if you're interested.
Yeah, and if you do grab a ticket early, you'll have early access to the forum. You'll be able to jump onto some of those articles that we were talking about that are exclusive to members and start gearing up, getting those creative juices flowing.
Okay, so I think that's it for this episode. And until next time, ride on.
Right on.
Thank you for listening to Not Quite Right. If you'd like to reach us via email or follow us on social media, you can find all the links on our website, notquiterightpodcast.com. That's WRITE. And if you enjoyed the show, we'd love it if you could leave us a 5-star review on your favourite podcasting app.
Something doesn't seem quite right.
Hush by Sandra Kempen. I'm Not Sorry by Madeline Howard. Clicks, ticks, taps, and time clock. Fuck, man. Clicks, tick. Clits, tits. All right. Clicks, ticks, taps, and time by Samantha Ryan.